1998. The winners and losers of the Tour de France were conspicuously dyed blonde in their celebrations and defeats, following the fashion of those Romanian soccer players who did it just weeks before in the World Cup, supposedly to avoid testing positive for doping in the hair sample controls. This edition of the most important cycling competition on the planet, in which only 96 of 189 participants finished, was marked by police abuse and the persecution of the athletes by the race organisers themselves, but especially by the dirtiest doping of all time. Most people know this tour because of the infamous Festina Affair, but not everyone remembers that in 2004, retroactive anti-doping controls were carried out. Controls which identified EPO in the samples left by the riders of that edition. They found that 99% of them were totally and utterly doped. As committed as Joe Biden observing young girls, or, in the interest of balance, as Donald Trump surrounded by plastic blondes at Jeffrey Epstein's parties. And so it was that the first three classified, and the winners of secondary classifications, and the most combative cyclist of the edition, and all the stage winners, tested positive for EPO in those tests just a few years down the line. Oh, this tour is a real odyssey that you are going to enjoy. And as always on this channel, we have done a great job of compilation. Now look, if you support this content, subscribe now to the channel. Join the membership, and if you can, donate some money with a super thanks to help us get out of this immense and grinding poverty in which we find ourselves. Now, get ready to enjoy the complicated Italian with the bald head covered with a piece of cloth, a rider who astonished the world, as well as course as the freckled, round-faced man sweating like a baked chicken after being surrounded by beer and cakes and concubines, or the three most doped French teams of all time. Oh, there was a lot to astonish the planet, and so, without further ado, let the show begin. After the 1997 edition of the Grand Boucle, of which you have already an extensive summary on this channel, everyone expected Jan Ullrich to be a historic champion, capable of crushing the rest of the riders not only in the Tour de France, but also in most of the cycling calendar, all thanks to his excellent riding ability and his impressive power when the roads were steep. However, the young man from Rostock, at the tender age of 24, became a real monster, fond of McTonight nights in fast food restaurants as well as the neon lights, always accompanied by his beloved Weihenstephan beers and his contacts who gave him succulent portions of snow on the hottest nights of the Spanish winter. When everyone expected a real meat grinder to show up in the 1998 season, the plump and greasy Jan appeared totally out of shape at the Telekom team's training camp in Fuerteventura, and he spent most of this campaign trying to slim down from a rather shameful 90 kilos to his usual 70 kilos seen in the 97 campaign. L'Equipe newspaper described Ullrich as a zombie on a bike who looked like a tourist at the races. And Tour patron Jean-Marie Leblanc himself considered the previous year's winner as an unworthy character. At the end of April, he had to concentrate on a very hard stealth preparation in the German Black Forest to lose that stubborn last 8 kilos so that he could get to his optimum. And all the while, many of his rivals were already focusing solely and exclusively on the Tour de France. Jan's results improved with time and with weight loss, but even so, he was still performing well below the level of his teammates, the rider much admired by this channel, Bjarne Riis. For in the Tour de Suisse, which he used as preparation for the Grand Boucle, Bjarne was going rather well. Needless to say, our lovely bald-headed Dane used this fact to postulate himself as a possible leader of the Telekom team at the ripe old age of 34. In the end, Ullrich arrived at the starting line in Dublin just 2 kilos overweight, but evidently hadn't enjoyed an ideal approach to a race as important as this one. His main rivals on paper were again the very dangerous Festina team of Bruno Roussel, whose supposed leader was the newly dyed platinum blonde Richard Virenque. Third in 96 and second in 97, the perennial doped-up winner of the mountains classification would take to the start line ready to attack whenever the roads got steep. And he would do so with the financial backing of France's biggest budget team, all of which allowed him to acquire the best arsenal of drugs available. His season had even been much brighter than others in the past. He had a great approach to the Tour, scoring in the weeks leading up to it a third place in a very tough French national championships won by the doped-up Laurent Jalabert, as well as a win of Megève in the Dauphiné Libéré. In addition, this year's home crowd favourite had one of the most doped and dangerous teams in cycling history. As always, his most loyal lieutenant would be Laurent Dufaux, who had won in his own country the Tour de Romandie, including 3 stages, as well as the Grand Prix Midi Libre, and he'd finished in the top 10 in 3 Ardennes Classics, all of which showed that the chemistry of the watchmakers was even better than in 1997 when they blew the rest away in the mountains. Oh, there was Guns N' Roses fan Laurent Brochard, who would be wearing nothing less than the rainbow jersey of world champion. And of course, don't forget the dangerous doped-up druggie and narco owner Pascal Hervé, also in platinum blonde. He was getting ready to pack his veins with as much of the good stuff as possible to help his leader Virenque. And then, if the classic suicide squad of dopers like Christophe Moreau, Armin Meier, Didier Roux and Neil Stevens was not enough, this year Festina had another new superstar. A very, very interesting Plan B. The guy with the worst eyesight with the best legs on the cycling planet. Good old Alex Zuller. As you could see in the video we made of the 1998 Giro d'Italia, the Swiss coupon salesman was signed as leader of the powerful French team to win the Corsa Rosa. But after a superb performance where he seemed to be the clear favourite to win the Giro, an excess with the drugs ended the Swiss in a rather more discreet final position. However, this year's Tour route was much more favourable to him, with a far less hilly edition than 1997. Big cojones Zuller was closely watched by Virenque, who didn't want any other leaders in the team. But Bruno Roussel knew that if the dyed-in-the-wool favourite failed, then today's financial advisor could be a match for Team Telekom. But evidently Festina were not the only favourites. Marco Pantani went into the 1998 edition of the Tour with the main goal of his season already accomplished. His dream was to win the Giro d'Italia, and he had done it with an epic and highly doped time trial performance after overtaking Zuller himself and Mappe's Russian Pavel Tonkov after those classic mountain exhibitions. As we have already indicated, the route of the 98 Tour was not entirely suitable for the characteristics of the coke-addict boyfriend of the no less coke-addicted and artistic Christina Janssen. But Marco had 2 great motivations. The first was the clear improvement in the chemistry of the Mercatone Uno team. Pantani had surrounded himself with the best Italian doctors, and his teammates were flying. The tender 37-year-old Massimo Pondenzana, the doped guinea pig Marco used in the Lugano time trial of the Giro, had finished an impressive 4th at the Volta Catalunya. And, most surprisingly, was 25-year-old climber Stefano Gazzelli, who was becoming the mini Pantani. With his bald head in the wind, he was crushing the chubby German, as well as monsters like Leonardo Piepoli, Francesco Casagrande and Peter Luttenberger at the Tour de Suisse. Previously, the Mercatone team had existed for Pantani, and for Pantani alone, but in 1998, it was looking like a much more complete team and therefore would be a far greater support for the Giro champion. Marco's second motivation, more mystical and spiritual, came from the death of the patron of the team sponsored by the supermarket chain, the legendary Luciano Pezzi, who, in his good old days as a gregario of the legendary Fausto Coppi, had asked Pantani on his deathbed to dope like the mythical climbing whoremonger of the 50s and bring home to Italy the Tour, marking a Giro Tour double that had not occurred since the days of the Campionissimo. Pantani took this so seriously that at times he thought he was a movie character. Literally, but we'll tell you about that when we talk about the mountain stages of this tour. As for other possible candidates, Spaniard Abraham Alano had had a much calmer campaign than the previous one, where he had failed miserably in the mountains and just at managing a partial victory in the form of the final time trial at Euro Disney. But this time the route was more favourable for him, and although he had not had the services of Michele Ferrari for 2 seasons, the Benesto team had found a new secret formula. We could see it in the Dauphiné Libéré, where, without Alano, the Friars literally swept the entire competition aside with a historic triplet made up of the doped Miguel Angel Peña and the drug-addicted and extremely dangerous José María Jiménez, and the legendary Frenchman Armand de las Cuevas, who had returned that year to the Spanish team. This bald-headed moron of strange ideologies and mystical thoughts crushed Festina, supported by his teammates in the Dauphiné. And then just a few days later, he did it to Telekom in the Route du Sud, where he beat no less on the Plateau de Bay the real monsters like the whoremongers Michael Bogard and Jan Ullrich on a day of cold and fog. However, this excess of chemistry was punished by the UCI, and just a few days after the continuous exhibitions of the Benesto team in the Dauphiné, the Spaniard Aitor Garmendia was sanctioned in the middle of the Vuelta a Catalunya for his high hematocrit of 54%. Something which the team boss, José Miguel Echevarri, could not even believe, hinting that it must be some kind of warning by Hein Verbruggen for Benesto not to play with the fireworks they had at their disposal. Other teams, however, were given carte blanche by the tour organisers, and they were obviously French. We're talking about 2 very dangerous blocks. There was Cofidis and the outlandish Casino of 1998. Now, Cofidis, the team that fired Lance Armstrong in one of the worst business deals in the history of cycling, they no longer had director Cyril Guimard or retired Tony Rominger, but they still had support from Dr. Bernard Sainz and his colleague Michele Ferrari, thanks to the figure of the 6th-place rider in the 97 Tour, Francesco Casagrande. Cecco was enjoying the drugs available to Alain Bondu's boys, enjoying them immensely and putting in some impressive displays in the Swiss and Italian mountains throughout the season. He had been preparing exclusively for the Tour. He was not the scrawny Casagrande that we would know years later. Then the doped Italian was a total rider, able to perform both on the flats and in the mountains, and he had a squad of real doping monsters, which you will know if you follow the full development of this video. On the other hand, the Casino of the current AG2R director Vincent Lavenu represented a totally different setup. They didn't have a man for the GC, but they were ready to spread terror on the French roads as if they were Freddy Krueger in the nightmares of beardless and tender teenagers. That group of doped cycling vermin like Jackie Durand, Alexander Vinokourov, Marco Salieri, Alberto Elli, Pascal Richard, Rolf Jarman, Bo Hamburger, Jan Kersipu, and especially the dealer Rodolfo Massi, they were going to storm the bench in the Grand Boucle in a season where they would surpass 60 stage victories. Among them, Flèche Wallonne, Bo Hamburger, and 2 victories in the Tour, which would leave everyone with their mouths wide open. Now, normally after this rather lengthy introduction, I would start right away with a stage review. But before the start of the 1998 Tour, there was a historic event which absolutely changed the rules of the cycling game forever. July the 8th, 1998, 3 days before the start of the Tour de France. Former Belgian cyclist and now Festina team masseur Willy Voet was on his way in his Fiat on loan from Almery Sports and sponsored by the Festina team to Calais in northern France, and there he would board a boat for Dublin. Days earlier he'd left the warehouses where Roussel's men kept their drugs in Lyon, and he travelled through France and Switzerland and Germany and Belgium to acquire between 400 and 800 bottles of capsules and pills of EPO and anabolics and growth hormones and maskers and tranquilizers and, well, all kinds of doping substances for the rather obsessed Richard Virenque and his teammates. The carrier pigeon Voet was unaware that Cyril Guimard, of whom we had spoken earlier, who was angry at having been expelled from the cycling world for embezzlement and economic corruption, would take revenge on all those who had denounced him. The macho French Sigma male, possibly coerced to avoid prison, told the French gendarmerie that Voet would cross the Franco-Belgian border at Neuville-en-Ferrand with a trunk full of doping substances in the fridge. And so, after waiting for him behind some bushes, the French authorities arrested the masseur and his huge shipment of drugs mentioned above. Although Voet had the nerve to say that those substances were for him and his personal use alone, which would have made him possibly the biggest junkie of all time, the gendarmerie already knew exactly who they were looking for. And they knew what they were looking for, and they knew why they were looking for it. And they had the evidence of having caught the official vehicle of the Festina team itself. Oh, the Festina Affair had begun. But the French public wasn't even aware of it, since they were more concerned about the World Cup held in their country, where the doped Zinedine Zidane crushed the doped Ronaldo Nazario, who almost died in that mythical French summer month. Voet would spend those days in prison, and what he would confess would shake the cycling universe, which was definitely looking the other way, specifically in the beautiful country of the Emerald Isle. Oh, Ireland, lovely, lovely Ireland, land of noble alcoholic people and green clovers and historic dopers. On July the 11th, 3 days after Voet's arrest, the tour started with a completely flat prologue through the streets of Dublin, a distance of only 5.6 kilometres. The Irish fans had a clear favourite, the Briton who was part of Roger Legier's very clean GAN team, Chris Boardman, who, after winning 2 prologues in 94 and 97, could now equal Thierry Marie and Eddy Merckx as the most successful in history for tour starts. But who struck first was, of course, a Festina rider, the then prologue specialist, the young, doped-up Christophe Moreau, making a tribute to Voet with a spectacular time of 6 minutes and 17 seconds. In fact, Bruno Roussel's boys rode a spectacular prologue, with Virenque and Brochard just 12 seconds behind the winner, and there was Dufault at 9 seconds and Alex Zuller at 7 seconds, showing that the Swiss could very well have recovered from the excesses of doping in the Italian Dolomites weeks earlier. However, who overtook Moreau after almost 1 hour in the hot seat wasn't one of the supposed favourites, but rather the dangerous doped American Bobby Julich. While his compatriot and good buddy Lance Armstrong returned to victory in the Tour of Luxembourg after almost 2 years lost to cancer, the gringo Julich was bidding to win the prologue and logged a time 1 second better than Moreau. It was the first exhibition of a Cofidis rider, team that will give us all lots to talk about in this competition. A contender for the GC, the last winner of a time trial in the Grand Boucle, Abraham Alano, he overtook the American's time with a fantastic final sprint, and he beat number 135 by just a few hundredths of a second. After seeing that the time trial world champion wearing the French national jersey and classic doping strategist Laurent Jalabert had failed to beat his records, it seemed that finally the Spanish Oreja could wear the yellow jersey of leader. But the Spaniard, positive for EPO in this same prologue, was surprised by the always clean Chris Boardman, led by the great creator of the movement for credible cycling. It wasn't the drugs that moved those slender yet stocky legs born near a Liverpool golf club. No, it was the people, the voices of the ever-wise Irish fans that carried their idol to victory, and he did it very convincingly, beating the leader of the Friars by 5 whole seconds, despite riding a hideous but rather effective Eddy Merckx bike, one which tried to copy Miguel Indurain's legendary Espada. Still to come, of course, was the yellow jersey, in a tradition that should never have disappeared. Jan Ullrich, in tribute to his victory the previous year, the German looked a little rounder, a little chubbier than in the previous edition, but when it came to pedalling, he showed a good cadence. And although he didn't seem to be at his best, he was performing out on the road where it mattered. At least he wasn't going to embarrass himself in Dublin, which was one of Rudy Prevenage's main fears. Just a few seconds later, he confirmed it with a remarkable 6th place, 5 seconds behind the Englishman. The Englishman, of course, dedicated his new yellow jersey to his wife. We imagine for not filling his fridge with vials of EPO, but rather with energy bars and cakes for the GAN insurance salesman who did so much for the average French citizen. And surprisingly, no one, absolutely no one, remembered that guy who was in jail, about to sing La Traviata to the Gallic gendarmes. Nobody forgot, of course, Marco Pantani, although he was rather under the radar, finishing 181st out of 189, demonstrating his great ability as a time trialist, when the drugs of Lugano weren't involved. And now it was time for the first road racing stage, starting and finishing in the Irish capital with 180 kilometres of flat and undulating terrain. In fact, Festina were completely at ease, even without the shipment of drugs that Voet should have brought to Irish soil. Months later, the masseur confessed that this was because if they needed any extra substances, Bruno Roussel's pupils had no problem acquiring them from other riders and employees on other teams, especially the Belgian Lotto team. There was a large breakaway consisting of, in principle, some not very dangerous riders, men such as Kelme's Juan José de Los Angeles, Casino's Benoit Selmont, Mappe's Stefano Zanini, and Lotto's Paul van Heft. All of them were watched by a rider from the always clean, least doped team in history, the German Jens Voet, who in 1998 had already showed his ability and credibility by keeping all these escapees at bay, by defending his leader Boardman. Behind was Seiko, the charismatic and self-proclaimed best sprinter in the world, big Mario Cipollini. They worked, even in the mountains, to cut down a gap that never went beyond 2 minutes. However, the wife-beater suffered an absurd crash just a few kilometres from the finish, when one of his teammates fell just ahead of him, and so he was completely out of the running for the win once the escapees were caught. In the sprint on the streets of Dublin, the new doped German champion Erik Zabel took a spectacular lead on the right side, but then, with a great comeback, Patrick Lefebvre's pupil and doped-up Belgian champion Tom Steels squeezed his kidneys to take a stupendous victory, ahead of the German procreator and the young Australian Robbie McEwen. Oh, it was a victory with a taste of redemption after his expulsion in 1997 for assaulting Frédéric Moncassin in the middle of a sprint. Boardman was still wearing yellow in this particular show in the English-speaking island of Ireland. Now evidently the news of Willy Voet's arrest had been slowly making its way into the media. At that time, the average casual cycling fan had no notion of what doping was. We spectators were innocent, we had no idea, and we believed that the only ones who doped were those athletes from the 80s who came from Eastern Europe, or who dared to beat the Americans in the Olympics. And in fact, the Tour de France organization itself was playing with that innocence since, although Jean-Marie Leblanc knew perfectly well what the French police had found in a Fiat car provided by the race bosses to the Festina team, he assured everyone that he had no intention of expelling the watchmakers from the race. He'd defend them and protect them under the presumption of innocence, despite the rather clear evidence of the systematic doping of those dirty riders. In fact, Jean-Marie Leblanc was more concerned with the race's own show. If the Irish were paying huge amounts of money, then they had to have a tribute to one of their own most legendary doped riders, Sean Kelly. He rode into the square that bears his name in his hometown as if he were John Kennedy himself through the squares of Dallas, waving to the average yokel from an old convertible, and all under the watchful eye of the future UCI president and then president of the Irish Federation, Pat McQuaid, a man whom both Kelly and Roach had described as self-serving vermin. As the race was still going on in Ireland, during the long, flat second stage of over 205 kilometres, this publicity stunt served Leblanc well, and so the Festina Affair didn't explode in the heads of all those present there. And moreover, on the way to Cork, the classic crashes of the first week of the Tour were back in the headlines. The yellow jersey, the yellow sports journalist, so it all came together, especially after seeing the very clean Chris Boardman wearing the yellow jersey crashing into a sidewall during an intermediate sprint. The British rider had to abandon. In tears and dirt, the race that had brought him glory and never gave him great sporting results. Within minutes, he was already in an ambulance with a neck brace, and he became the 13th yellow jersey to abandon the race, after his weeping former teammate Stefan Oehler in 1996. Along with Boardman, a man who would win the Tour the following year, Johan Bruneel, in the Once team's new black jersey, also fell. Legier's clean men wanted to pay homage to their leader, and so the Swedish giant Magnus Backstedt pulled with all his might on the wild Fredrik Monkesson, but in a chaotic sprint with no order at all, it was Mappe's Czech champion Jan Svorada who surprisingly took the win. A second victory for Lefebvre's men with two different doped sprinters. Curiously, Olano was again left without wearing the yellow jersey, since, thanks to time bonuses, the doped procreator, Erik Zabel, wore the yellow jersey for the first time in his career, just before flying to France, and then the real terror began for those riders who thought they were untouchable. The third stage of that tour between Roscoff and Lorient was 169 kilometres, and it was far more hectic than anyone expected, making it clear that the riders were hardly afraid at that time. On the Breton Hills, 9 riders jumped out of the bunch. There was Bo Hamburger and Pascal Chanteur with a pirate scarf on his head from the pirate ship Casino's galleon, and you will see that he would be involved in all the sources of this tour. There was the current director of Banesto, Vicente Garcia Acosta. There was the then-doped US champion, George Hincapie of US Postal, always clean but also doped. And there was the always clean but also doped in 1998 Stuart O'Grady of the always clean GAN team. There was Kelme's Francisco Cabello, there was FDJ's Xavier Jan, there was the East German Jens Heppner of Telekom, and as always, when there were movements from the German telephonists, there was a Festina rider, and not just any old Festina rider, but the very dangerous bully Pascal Hervé, wearing his hair in an impressive shade of silver, which made him look like Princess Zelda's horse in Tears of the Kingdom. This group quickly worked for a variety of common interests, pulling almost 8 minutes clear of the peloton by the halfway point of the stage. The 2 Casino riders in particular were passing and working well. Bo Hamburger was the best classified of those in the breakaway. The dangerously doped Hervé crowned the lead of the stage's climbs and thus achieved his goal of dressing in red as King of the Mountains for Festina. And so after that he had no problems, he was eager to work. And that was just the same day that the press discovered that among Willy Voet's drugs there were hundreds of bottles of EPO. Arriving in Lorient, it was the 27-year-old who tried to attack in a surprise and rather aggressive way, but fortunately, Xavier Jean and Jens Heppner caught him and overtook him. These 2 riders quickly formed an understanding, and the 10th place rider of the 92 Tour took advantage of his experience and his better chemical preparation to win the sprint, rather simply, over the FDJ rider. Telekom lost the yellow jersey to the doped Hamburger, but they got a more than remarkable stage win, one which they hadn't expected at all. The overall classification, as you can see, was really close between the escapees and the pack mules Hincapie and O'Grady, eager to get a taste of yellow. A very long 252-kilometre stage between Plouay and Cholet awaited the peloton the next day. It was the longest stage of the entire tour, with those classic sunflower fields admiring the passing of the doped athletes. 2 men escaped on this day. The luckiest doped man in history, lucky Jackie Jeroen, representing the ubiquitous Casino team who made pirate bandanas fashionable, and FDJ's Frenchman, Damien Nazon. But they wouldn't last long in the lead, as an intermediate sprint would determine who would be the new leader by bonus seconds. There, the always clean O'Grady beat the previous year's winner Erik Zabel and the We Do podcaster in Plumelec. Good old George was left with the taste of honey on his lips, a result he would repeat in the second intermediate sprint in Pauillac. A crash in Cholet with 2 kilometres to go hurt the then sprinter Hincapie, who lost his final chance of wearing yellow before Lens. And then there was the man with the stars and stripes on his battered Italian sausage, big Mario Cipollini. In such a tight sprint, the TVM men took advantage of the great placement of their doped sprinter, Jeroen Blijlevens, ahead of fellow EPO dopers Nicola Menali and Jan Svorada, and taking a victory for the 4th consecutive year at the Tour de France. Stuart O'Grady became the second Australian after Phil Anderson to wear the leader's yellow jersey, and he brought the glory back to the ever-clean Gans. Whoa, they performed like gods in the first week of that tour. However, that same afternoon, the press were not so keen on the leader of the Tour de France. The World Cup had ended with Barthez, Zidane, Deschamps, Blanc and Desailly drunk with emotion. Now it was time for the sports press to turn their attention to Willy Voet. At that time, he had already declared to the police that there was systematic doping in the Festina team, and Bruno Roussel, the manager of the most powerful team in the world, went to the police station to testify with Dr. Erik Zabel about the police investigation. And that same day, Roussel denied the existence of doping in the team, and the gendarmerie let them go. But popular pressure had already begun. Leaks were emerging, and journalists were following Bruno Roussel around. The always clean director, Roger Leger, the same one who had tested positive as a professional cyclist, had no qualms about appearing in the media, calling for the immediate expulsion of the Festina team. Conspiracies reached such a point that the French team's own riders thought that other watch companies were behind the snowball that kept on growing, since they supposedly wanted to eliminate Festina as the official sponsor of the Tour de France timing and stopwatches. But the show must go on. On the fifth day, the riders faced another flat stage between Cholet and Châteauroux. It was the first rainy stage of the tour, and one in which the leader himself, Stuart O'Grady, fell while passing through a small village along with several of his teammates. Thankfully, it was a fall without serious consequences. And then three relatively unimportant riders decided to break away. There was ASIC's Italian Fabio Roscioli, Big Mat's Frenchman Thierry Gouvenou, and Rabobank's Dutchman, Art Vierhouten. A team, Rabobank, that was not enjoying the best services of Dr. Linders on this occasion. With a few kilometres to go, they were caught by the bunch, and this time, after a bit of violent switching between Jan Svorada and George Hincapie, there was a beautiful duel between Zabel and Cipollini, accelerating on his 53-tooth chainring and smallest sprocket at 65 kilometres per hour. The victory, of course, went to the Seiko rider, the first occasion where Pavarotti had the chance to sing E di Pensiero from La Donna Immobile, raising his arms and beating all of his rivals while Ipo surged in his tanned and toned legs. Oh yes, what a sight! Now, it wasn't Super Mario's best tour, but he had risen from the crashes like a phoenix from the ashes, and he would continue to prove who was the number one. And that same day, Bruno Roussel, following investigations, lost his director's license, and he was called to confess the day after. A 204-kilometre day between La Châtre and Brive awaited the riders the next day. They were leaving the region where current Cofidis director Cédric Vasseur achieved lifelong fame and fortune by winning a stage and taking the Tour lead, whilst in the ranks of the ever-clean Gan team. And he became the new hero of the French, who believed in his story of purity and welcomed him like Jesus Christ himself. He appeared in his hometown, accompanied by Jean-Marie Leblanc. Perhaps because of all this, he got into another breakaway, but this time not alone. He was accompanied by Kelme's José Luis Rodriguez Garcia and current Movistar director Max Chiandri. Behind, there was Stuart O'Grady, still fighting valiantly for bonus seconds to keep him in yellow, since the next day there was a flat time trial in Corrèze where he would surely lose the jersey to time-trialling mastodons like Abraham Alano or Jan Ullrich. Now, despite Jean-Marie Leblanc's wishes for his oh-so-clean protégé to reach the finish line as in 1997, the peloton eventually caught the riders, and again a sprint would define the winner of the stage. Donkey-turned-racehorse Andrea Taffi was trying to bring Tom Steels and Jan Svorada to the head of the bunch, but Gian Matteo Fanini ended up putting his leader Super Mario back in the best possible position for the final 100 metres. The new green jersey wearer, but so far unsuccessful stage winner Erik Zabel tried his best, but Pavarotti came in again, this time singing Hero, as he'd done with Mariah Carey just a few months earlier. He was ahead of Nicola Minali, and he took his second consecutive win, surrounded by beautiful and attractive French hostesses. No doubt he was thinking about how to harass them only minutes later. However, nothing, absolutely nothing else mattered at that very moment, for the French police had called Bruno Roussel and Dr. Reichardt back to testify. They were informed in advance that Willy had been singing like a canary, for he had been under investigation for days. And then, against the ropes, the story came out, and so Bruno Roussel and his team doctor, it was time to face the music. The gendarmerie knew that Festina had a warehouse in Lyon full of doping substances, a warehouse they'd searched from top to bottom, and they'd found papers justifying payments between the director of Festina and some bank transfers going to all kinds of dealers who passed the drugs on to the cyclists. Faced with this weight of evidence, they had no choice but to confess the truth. Yes, there was systematic doping. And yes, they were trying to avoid or falsify the anti-doping controls. One of the tactics they used was to go with the cyclist to the anti-doping test with a bandage on a supposedly injured area. Underneath the bandage, they'd carry a bottle with clean urine, one which didn't belong to them, but they'd swap it with the original, giving a negative result in the anti-doping control. Roussel acknowledged that this technique was not unique to Festina. It was widespread. Virtually all the teams were doing it, and the fans were really just watching a pitiful farce. For the fans, it was like a moment identical to that children experience when they discover that Santa is a coke addict, played by Tim Allen, and really a fictional character who doesn't exist in real life. Oh dear. The tour was already a scandal after Bruno Roussel's confessions, and it all resulted in what became known worldwide as the Festina Affair. Jean-Marie Leblanc appeared at a hypocritical early morning press conference, expelling his country's darling team from the Tour de France, under the excuses of pressure and an unbreathable atmosphere for the race itself. Now previously, such scandals like the PDM case in the 1991 Tour de France had always been covered up under the umbrella of the press. But in 1998, either due to economic interests or indeed the pressure of a communist sports minister of the French government, the scandal came to light, and Leblanc was just a puppet with one interest, dancing on the strings pulled by the Tour de France and Omari Sports' commercial interests. Oh, there were sporting ethics involved, of course. The media knew of Roussel's problems, and Leblanc tried to be as paternalistic as possible at the time. He kindly asked Richard Virenque and his teammates to leave the race and to collaborate fully with the police, assuring them that they would be protected by French law. This was obviously a lie, but Leblanc was only interested in protecting his own interests, and it was in his interest that the Festina team should stop tarnishing the clean name of his clean race, won for the previous 2 years by the squeaky clean Bjarne Riis and Jan Ullrich. Leblanc in that press conference was sending out a clear message. The Tour was more important than the teams. And the riders began to be afraid. Very afraid. Only a few of the bravest ones dared to take a stand. Amongst them, the Italian Marco Pantani. They told the media that the situation wouldn't be fixed by kicking Festina out of the Tour. The next morning, before the time trial, several riders of the French team gave several interviews to the press in a luxurious hotel in a castle. Amongst them was, of course, the legendary Richard Virenque, in tears for not being able to fulfill his dream whilst totally doped. Willy Voet declared to the police that Virenque had gone to the limits of health, risking his life with all the substances he'd taken during the last few seasons, and that his arsenal for 1998 was, without any doubt, more extensive and certainly more potent than anything he'd seen in more than 30 years involved in professional cycling. Virenque wanted to be the successor to Bernard Hinault and win a Tour for the French, the first time since 1985. But when he attempted the final assault on the Paris crown, his case had blown up in his hands. And while this controversy was raging in the cycling world, just what was UCI President Hein Verbruggen doing at such a tragic time for the sport he represented? Yes, he was with young concubines paid for by Fidel Castro in Havana, while presiding over a track cycling championships that almost nobody was interested in. Of course, without making any statements or showing my face, it was at that moment that I realized at the tender age of 8 that professional sport was a real lie. How sad. And yet the worst in that Tour de France was yet to come. The Festina team itself had in fact prepared the time trial bikes for that 58-kilometre stage between Mérignac and Corrèze, perhaps hoping that some conspiracy theory about clashes between rival watchmaking brands to be the official Tour timekeeper would be the cause of the expulsion of their team. But they couldn't start on that broken, hilly and twisty course, a route that was ideal for world champion and French idol Laurent Desbiens. But all the attention was taken by the Festina Affair, and so the TV cameras didn't connect with the race until the start of the big favourite, the formerly chubby Jan. However, before that, other candidates for the final victory had crossed the finish line. Marco Pantani with a rather discreet time of 1 hour, 19 minutes and 46 seconds, a long way from his stratospheric time trial in Lugano a month and a half earlier. Oh, there was Francesco Casagrande of Cofidis, who was undoubtedly the best of the pure climbers in that time trial. He logged a good time of 1 hour, 17 minutes and 48 seconds, giving him 8th final place on the day. Alain Bondu's Cofidis were flying, thanks to their incredible systematic doping inherited from Dr. Ferrari. And without Dr. Mabuse's men from Festina, they finally had a candidate to fight for the overall victory. Casagrande would never again do such a good time trial in his sporting career. However, the time that shocked the world before the cameras connected was that of the then unknown American, Tugboat. Yes, Tyler Hamilton himself. He'd practically just rolled up into Europe and was making his debut in a Grand Tour stage race. And he was experiencing the improvements that had made Bobby Julich a Tour de France contender and turned George Hincapie into an almost yellow jersey. He felt like a kid in chemistry class. And as these archival images show, Hamilton and US Postal marked this time trial in red on their blood transfusion calendar, and he rode a blistering time of 1 hour, 16 minutes and 35 seconds. Several other riders impressed as they crossed the finish line, such as the financial supporter of working girls, Michael Bogart. There was the doped-up giant anaconda who defeated Indurain, Melchior Mauri, or the granny-loving Russian, Yevgeny Berzin, but none of them came close to Tugboat's time. Not even the legendary doper, bald-headed friend of the channel, Bjarne Riis. He was up to his old tricks by claiming that the road would decide who the real Telekom leader was. It clearly wasn't going to be him at the tender age of 34, and after crossing the finish line with a lousy time, for him, of 1 hour, 19 minutes and 9 seconds, there he was with his mouth wide open, sweating like a pig. Only Hamilton's teammate, the Russian Vyacheslav Ekimov, came close to the gringo, with a good time of 1 hour, 17 minutes and 5 seconds, one which left him in 5th place at the end of the stage. And it made it clear that the US Postal were really cooking up some good stuff since the arrival of Lance Armstrong at the team. Now, as you can see, the dirty Festina riders were leaving, but the great clean heroes were arriving. From the United States of America, they'd fix this broken system. A system that, of course, included Jan Ullrich, the late-night whiskey lover, who, although he was visibly in worse shape than in 1997, he was still a real monster every time he had to get on a time trial bike. The German gradually beat the stratospheric Hamilton's split times, but without much of a gap. There was 35 seconds at the intermediate point, and then he accelerated in the final part. He was coupled man and machine on the Pinarello bike, and the raw power kept pumping, and so he finished with a great time of 1 hour, 15 minutes and 25 seconds, an average of more than 46 kilometers per hour. It would, of course, be the best time of the day. But this still wasn't the Jan of 1997. A rookie, yes, doped up to his back legs like Tugboat, was 1 minute and 10 seconds off the German's time. No longer the big gaps where he crushed everyone like he had done the year before. There were obviously still a few more riders to come, and there was one who continued to surprise everyone, showing this amazing preparation and dedication of the gringos and Cofidis. We're talking, of course, about Bobby Julich. After his great performance in the Prologue, he was only 1 minute and 18 seconds behind number one in this long time trial. That put him third both in the stage and in the GC. There was Ullrich and doped Bo Hamburger. Evidently those men didn't come to sell loans and credits. They were willing to do anything with anyone, including this good American rider who was far from really being a true superstar. Another doped rider who performed well in this time trial was the world champion Laurent Jalabert, as expected, recording a time of 1 hour, 16 minutes and 49 seconds, placing him fourth in the final, and this made him dream of a possible podium. Abraham Alano, who failed again after his time trial triumph at Euro Disney, lost 2 minutes and 13 seconds to Jan in a time trial without long straight roads, on terrain where he should in theory be much better than several of his rivals. And finally, there was the leader, Stuart O'Grady. He rode a time trial that was always clean, and he made the best of his chances. He didn't take off his helmet, and he finished in 15th position. It was not enough to keep the lead, of course, and the jersey passed onto the shoulders of the day's winner, Jan Ullrich, who was quickly advised by Godefroot and Pevenage. They had to look for allies because they had left the biggest possible rival, Marco Pantani, alive. For the first time, the Italian polytoxicomaniac had suffered no mishaps on the flat, and he had lost only 5 minutes to Ullrich before the mountains. That would, of course, be enough for the Ullrich of the year before, but would it be enough for the former fat man of 1998? Undoubtedly, the withdrawal of the Festina team had changed everyone's possible tactics. Zola, Dufault and Vironk were no longer there, and the rules of the game were being written anew, and so Telekom decided to play the next day. The 8th stage, finishing in Montauban, was the classic flat day with hills, 190 kilometers, and Telekom now had the opportunity to fight with Erik Zabel for a stage, as they had done in 1997, immediately after the time trial in Saint-Étienne. They knew they needed allies, and allies were duly found, from the Cofidis of Francesco Casagrande and Bobby Julich. Logically, they didn't let these two riders escape, but they did let 2 others from the French team, the dangerous party animal and poly-drug addict Philippe Gaumont, may he rest in peace, and also the dangerous confidant of doping practices, Laurent Desbiens. Alongside them, there was a pack of real doping monsters, such as the new Italian champion and doped donkey Andrea Taffi of Mappe, and our much-admired lucky Jackie Durand of Casino. There was the incredible 100% clean winner of Paris-Roubaix, Frédéric Guédon, and then the forgotten but also doped Eddie Mazzolini of Seiko. There was the unknown doped Polti rider Fabio Sacchi and the mythical Finnish guinea pig Una Lauka, who had left Festina to now be squeaky clean at Lotto. A team that, remember, had passed drugs to Bruno Roussel's boys. Surely through this legendary mammal who kept turning that wheel in his cage, a supply would always be there. At 40 degrees Celsius, the Telekom strategy was working. The gap between the escapees was more than 10 minutes at several points along the stage, giving Laurent Desbiens the yellow jersey at the end of the day. Still Knox-loving Gaumont decided to work with all his might in the final 20 kilometers to maintain the lead, something he managed to do thanks to his incredible, unbridled raw power. With 5 kilometers to go, he was dropped, and attacks began to emerge among the other beings from outer space. Eddie Mazzolini, who had avoided working all day, tried in the final kilometer, but then an oh-so-impressive Taffy jumped away. Powerful attacks left, right and centre, but he was ahead, looking for the 3rd triumph for Mappe, the 3rd triumph with what would be the 3rd different national champion. The Finnish guinea pig seemed to fall off the pace, and so it looked like victory would have to be shared among the other 5 monsters. Among them, the fastest, the smartest, and of course the luckiest was again Jackie Durand, the likeable character who followed Taffy's wheel only to launch an incredible casino-style massive EPO-sponsored kidney shot, overtaking the Italian donkey and getting his 3rd Tour de France victory. Each one more incredible than the last. They could have investigated Casino instead of Festina, but Vincent Lavenue's men were counting on luck, and Joker Durand, who made everyone around him look incredibly unlucky, well, on that day, he was untouchable. His compatriot Desbiens took the promised yellow jersey with a lead of 14 seconds over Taffy, and 3 minutes 21 seconds over Jan Ullrich. The Telekom plan had gone well. exceedingly well. And it would be seen how successful it was over the coming days. The last of the flat days before the arrival of the high mountains was between Montauban and Pau, and it was 210 kilometers on another very hot day at 40 degrees Celsius. It was all too much for Mario Cipollini, who, as he usually did in the Tour, retired before the arrival of the mountains. He was ready to do some bathing in a jacuzzi with some female who he could treat as a simple means-to-an-end meretrix. He chose one of his fantastic suits among the 400 that he had in his closet of being a man-about-town Sigma male. Yes, it was holiday time for Mario. He could hear the call. Meanwhile, the breakaway of the day would be fully consented to by the peloton, because with the heat and the upcoming arrival of the Pyrenees, plus the constant fear of being caught with doping substances, the situation was less than ideal for riding at more than 50 kilometers per hour average along the plains of a baking southwestern France. As always, there was a Cofidis and a casino in the break. This time, Italian veteran Massimiliano Lelli and former Tour de Suisse winner Christophe Agnolotto. And then there was world bronze medalist Leon Van Bon of Rabobank, Big Mat's Russian Alexei Sivakov, father of the current rider who's renounced his nationality, the platinum blonde dyed to avoid testing positive Francisco Benitez of Vitalicio Seguros, and the always clean Jens Voet of Gan, again in another Tour breakaway. Evidently, it was Lelli and Agnolotto who showed their impressive drug load and attacked on the first climb that they could see to take Benitez and Sivakov out of the equation, with Voet and Van Bon taking their time to rejoin the wheels of the men from those doped French teams. The four arrived together in Pau, and there it was that the Dutchman Van Bon, who, thanks to his impressive top speed, was able to win, ahead of Voet and the other two slower but still incredibly doped riders. At least Leinders Medicine worked on real killers like Van Bon, a legendary rider with beautiful blue eyes, and he performed better than ever in his career in that epocha. Desbiens arrived in the Pyrenees as leader, a Pyrenees with two decisive stages that would change the fate of the race. The first one was the classic mountainous course between Pau and Luchon, almost 200 kilometers long, and with an enchainment of the Aubisque, Tourmalet, Aspan and Peressourde. The first thing to note was the incredible fall in temperatures. After overnight rain, the temperature fell to 20 degrees Celsius in Pau, 20 less than the previous day. A pleasant temperature, but it was obviously going to be much lower at the tops of the mountains, and that would greatly affect the riders. This stage had been marked in red by the Festina team, reminding them to repeat the tactics of 1997 and blow the Telekom apart in the hills. But they were no longer there, and so there was tension, palpable tension amongst Jan Ullrich and the rest of the team. On the flat road to the Aubisque, only Fabio Roscioli of Asics, already doped in 1993 by doctors Francesco Conconi and Giovanni Grazzi, he was the only one who dared to attack, but he wasn't a real climber. He was a combative guy, certainly, but not a real climber. Arriving on the Colossus of the Aubisque, he was immediately caught by the local hero of the French rednecks, Cédric Vasseur of the always clean Gan. He decided to jump from the bunch, seeing that Telekom didn't want to go to war without Festina there. In fact, the peloton climbed the Aubisque at a YouTube cyclotourist pace, with Ullrich and Galibier and the Cofidis and casinos in the lead, a pace absolutely unbecoming of a competition like the Tour de France, a pace that was becoming rather embarrassing, letting those two men, who weren't climbers at all, go off the front. Vasseur eventually left Roscioli behind and had the pleasure of reaching the summit at an altitude of over 2,000 meters in the lead. But with 1 kilometer to go, the peloton finally sprang into life, accelerating forward thanks to an attack by the ultra-Catholic and incendiary-doped Luc Leblanc. And then he was suddenly followed by the 9 men of the casino team, in a tactic absolutely impossible to understand without the presence of doping. 2 of them left Leblanc behind and went after the mountain points, the Italians Alberto Eli and Rodolfo Massi. The latter rider, 33 years old at this time, was having the season of his life after being a gregarious hustler in mediocre Italian teams. He had won the Tour of the Mediterranean, and he even came close to winning La Doyenne at Liège. but he'd saved his best fireworks for this Tour de France. The two Italians accelerated so violently that, seeing the gap they'd made, they decided to go for Vasseur on the descent. Now this descent will always go down in the annals of history for how dangerous it was. The rain had arrived at this point, you see, and not only was the downpour falling on the riders, but there was an intense fog, a fog which prevented you from seeing beyond the wheel of your own bike. Several riders crashed in the early corners. Riders such as Jens Voet and Abraham Alano. They were able to continue, but they were sore and damaged. And there was the Colombian Hernán Buenajora, winner of the Volta Catalunya, and the Italian Francesco Casagrande, the real leader of Cofidis for the Tour de France. Casagrande had to abandon due to the damage sustained in that crash. A real shame, because he had been one of the best climbers in the Corrèze time trial. And in addition to the drug load, he was also in stratospheric form. In fact, Cassetta would go on to impressively beat the doped Axel Merckx in the Classica San Sebastian just weeks later, and would end up being suspended after testing positive for testosterone in the Giro del Trentino and the Tour de Romandie, competitions in which he had participated in May. Now just look at the speed of the Epocha anti-doping controls. They weren't hanging around, were they? Now from here, we are sure that this is one of the greatest what-ifs in the history of cycling. Could Casagrande have won that 1998 Tour? Let us know in the comments if you think this true doping monster would have had his chance that year. Apart from these two contenders, up to 17 riders ended up abandoning on that hellish, Dantesque day. There was the polydrug addict Gaumont, the combative Laurent Roux of TVM, or the future winner of 9 Tour de France, Johan Bruneel. Almost all of them seriously hurt by crashes on this incredible descent. Elie and Massey caught up with Vasseur, and then the leading trio started to increase the gap, second by second. Telekom didn't see Casino as rivals for the GC, and they decided not to increase the pace on the terrain between the Aubisque and the Tourmalet. And so the breakaway built a lead of 3 whole minutes. Faced with this passivity, 2 new riders went forward. Of course, there was another Casino rider, the same Christophe Agneluto, who had been more than 200 kilometers in the breakaway the day before. And then there was the big mat rider who had been in Casino the year before, Philippe Bordenave. Today this would seem embarrassing, but at the time, with the Festina Affair still very recent, it all seemed relatively normal. As they opened up a gap on the peloton, several riders jumped out of the bunch. There was the high hematocrit master, Riccardo Focconi of Mercatone, the then unknown Christophe Rinero of Cofidis, with his cap on backwards, such a stylish boy, and the Belgian of the Lotto trafficking team, Peter Farazin. There was Benestos César Solin. He abandoned his compatriot Olano. There was another Casino rider, Pascal Chanteur, and then the same Leon Van Bon who'd won just the day before. There was the friend of Eufemiano Fuentes, Francisco Cabello of Kelme. And then the dyed pink to avoid testing positive rider, Pascal Derame of US Postal. Oh, and there were so many other adventurers, all wanting to party. At the foot of the Tourmalet, the advantage of the leading trio was 2.5 minutes over Bordenave and Agneluto, and 3.5 minutes over the group of Rinero and Focconi, and 6 minutes over the peloton. A peloton that seemed to be like a herd of cattle being led towards pasture. The ascent of the Tourmalet was absolutely disappointing, nothing like the 1997 edition. Despite the poor visibility, the pace of the Telekom riders, led by veteran Udo Bolts, was too slow, and no one, absolutely no one, dared to attack, even to try to gain a minimal advantage. 20 boring kilometers ended with Alberto Elie passing Vasseur and Massey. They were 2 minutes ahead of the then unknown Christophe Rinero, who had attacked the chasing group and overtook the duo of Agneluto and Bordenave. He was so unknown that not even French TV bothered to record him. The big bunch came along with a 5-minute deficit and continued to lose more time on the way to the Aspin. It was such a slow pace that even Abraham Alano, who'd fallen off the Tourmalet again as in 1997, easily caught up with the bunch on the descent of the mythical pass. Many people remember the boring epos of US Postal's Blue Train, but on that day in 1998, the men in pink and white of Telekom were trying to do exactly the same, to bore the sheep and bore the spectators who were used to pyrotechnic displays. The firework displays had ceased to exist once Festina had left, and there, of course, there was the constant fear in the peloton which didn't help at all. Some second-rank men like Giuseppe Di Grandi, Marco Serrano or Leonardo Piepoli managed to escape from the group. But among the big names, the only one who dared to try it was the French champion, Big Cojones Jalabert. However, within a few meters, several riders like Dariusz Baranowski of the US Postal jumped him, and so he was quickly caught. At the top of the S-band this time, it was the dangerous Rodolfo Massi who took first place from Vasseur. They had 2 minutes advantage over a then unknown Rinero, who was going for it alone with more than 60 kilometers. Continuous roller coaster. More than 5 minutes behind was the peloton, led by the Dutch financial supporter of working girls and national champion, Michael Bogart, who launched a very cheap attack that was quickly followed by Fernando Escartin and Dariusz Baranowski, and the rest of the important men of the Tour. On the descent, Laurent Jalabert rejoined the group, and did so simply out of boredom, as he declared at the finish line. He wanted to see if the race could be animated in some way. Then there was another Cofidis, the 31-year-old Swiss sprinter Roland Meyer. He decided to attack on the descent and on the uphill towards the Peresort. There was a general consensus that Ullrich was not in the best form of his career. It could be seen in a certain hesitancy of attitude, such as giving away the yellow to Desbiens, or barely working until the last climb of the day. And on the classic Peresort, with its constant slope at 7% for 8 kilometers, it was a very affordable slope with its long straights, and it was ideal for keeping things together and ensuring that there were no big differences. Up the road ahead, Vincent Lavenu saw that Rodolfo Massi had saved his energy until the Aspan, and that he was in much better shape than Elie, and so he decided to sacrifice him to increase the pace and try to get rid of this idol of the French people. He didn't succeed, but he did leave him sufficiently stunned, and so when he'd stopped working, the 33-year-old Massi, already without a cap and certainly without any shame, attacked, and Vasseur stayed in place after a few meters of trying to chase him. And the drug dealer and mafioso escaped, flying on to victory. Behind them, the Telekom team stepped up the pace, because they saw that Jalabert and Olano were having trouble keeping up with the telephonists. And Jan Ullrich himself took the head of the bunch. Suddenly we were back in 96 or 97 when he was working for his then bald-headed, doped-up leader, friend of the channel Bjarne Riis, of course. The image was hilarious. Ullrich was imposing himself on the race, demonstrating the great power in his legs, as he had done the previous year in Val Louron, while his teammate, Bjarne Riis, was just following the wheel of the rivals, without working for a second. And yet he'd promised days before in several interviews that Ullrich had yet to beat him. The fun-loving, beer-loving German ended up gradually catching up with both Piepoli's group and the then-unknown Christophe Rinero, and the group of favourites gradually dwindled until it was composed of Ullrich himself, Bobby Julich, Marco Pantani, Fernando Escartin, the whoremonger Michael Bogart, Leonardo Piepoli, Giuseppe Di Grandi, the party animal José María Jiménez, the Frenchman Jean-Cyril Robin of the already prepared by Ferrari US Postal, and his Catholic compatriot Leblanc. Oh, and the aforementioned friend of the channel, Bjarne Riis. Ullrich had been on the front for 5 kilometers, unassisted, and then the cameras changed their focus from the bald Dane to the bald Italian, the recently self-styled pirate, with a scarf similar to those of the men from Casino, but here in the Italian supermarket version. And then, perhaps because of the acting classes of his drug-addict girlfriend, he decided to attack, with 2 kilometers to go to the top. A superb move with so much power, well, it looked like David Coulthard's McLaren sweeping a poor Minardi aside as he passed Jan Ullrich, flying through the fog, clutching the drops and looking back to see that no one was following him. The image was shocking. He was no longer that bald guy with giant ears and no style who looked at it straight out of Shrek's swamp. Oh no! Now he was the cool guy of cycling, with a bandana on his head, and his facial operations, and his colourful Bianchi bike. And the crowd loved that. They cheered him on, "Oh, you rascal!" And then he overtook the idol Vasseur. The leading trio was more than 5 minutes ahead of Pantani before the start of the climb, but in the last 2 kilometers they reduced the gap to such an extent it looked like they were going to catch Massi and win the stage. Only Fernando Escartin, supported by the wise advice of Ufe, attacked Ullrich in a more subtle way. far from reaching the stratospheric level of the Pirate. Massey crowned the Peresord in the lead, showing that Casino had premium gasoline, although now he was only 40 seconds ahead of Pantani and 1 minute ahead of Escartine. There were only 15 kilometers left, the continuous descent to Luchon, and being a practically straight-line drop, the heavier Rodolfo Massey managed to keep a lead over the consummate downhill rider. Bjarne Riis finally got to work downhill and managed to catch Fernando, and then we watched the show of the Pirate, descending in a posture that is nowadays forbidden by the UCI killjoys. Hanging off the back of the bike, the saddle touching his tummy and the rear wheel rubbing his sweet round bottom. But it was not enough. The drug dealer Rodolfo Massey had been 140 kilometers in the wind and air and rain on his old and wrinkled face, and he entered euphoria, celebrating the greatest triumph of his professional career. A triumph that still belongs to him and is still there in the official Tour de France palmarès, despite confessing months later that he had passed drugs to many important men of the peloton and that he had doped like a mule with EPO in 1998. He hadn't ridden the Tour since 1990. He wasn't a sprinter nor a climber, but he had now won the most important, historic Pyreneean stage, and he managed to elevate himself to first in the King of the Mountains classification. And even so, his greatest moment of fame would come later. 36 seconds behind, Marco Pantani crossed the finish line, a psychological blow to all his rivals who came in 23 seconds behind the Pirate, led by the whoremonger Bogart with the new race leader Jan Ullrich and the new second place Bobby Julich. Bo Hamburger, no laughing at the back, kept his podium place by crossing with Alano and Berzin less than a minute behind Ullrich. And more than 2 minutes behind were other protagonists of the day, like Jalabert, Rinero or Vasseur. The new leader showed that he was strong and not at all like a fat man. He showed that when he set the pace that only 10 riders could chase and follow, but he still couldn't do anything against Pantani. But Pantani was more than 4 minutes behind in the GC. But in a very short distance he had managed to do considerable damage to number one. Oh dear. This would take some thinking about. Walter Godefroot was very clear. He had tried to buy the Pirate in some way, since without Viron and Zula, the only rival of the German champion would be the Italian Pirate. And they tried to do it on the very next day, en route to the Plateau de Bay, the pass where the crazy de las Cuevas had crushed Ullrich just 2 weeks earlier in the Route du Sud. Today they would climb it after 170 kilometers, after already ascending the Col de Monte, the Porte d'Aspet, the Col de la Cour and the Col de Port, passes of much lesser importance than the final hors-category climb of 16 kilometers at 8% average gradient. Unlike the previous day, the sun came out, with a temperature of 27 degrees Celsius. But the riders climbed the first two passes at, well, really what we can only describe as a neutralized race pace, and only the Casino dynamic duo of Elie and Massey were animated enough to score points on the mountain climbs. All of this was with the crude excuse of stopping for another year at the statue dedicated to the late Fabio Casatelli, and in connection with the non-obligatory helmet rule. But it was perhaps the calmest moment of the entire race, and where at least all the riders were seen to be united for the same cause. The first to attack were the unknown Big Mat rider Lilian Le Breton and the Spanish veteran José Luis Rodríguez García of Kelme, who had already attacked on the first stage, and here he would find more or less the same result. The latter easily left the Frenchman behind, and upon reaching the third pass of the day, the Col de la Cour, his teammate José Javier Gomez and the Swiss Cofidis rider Roland Meyer attacked to catch Rodriguez with tremendous ease. Bib number 177 decided to act as a shuttle for his teammate, prepared by Dr. Fuentes, escaping with that strange blonde who had suddenly mutated into a climber almost overnight and was already in the top 20 overall. In fact, with great ease, he left Pipi Gomez behind after a few kilometres, and, despite suffering an absurd crash on the descent, he continued in the lead with total ease, demonstrating that Cofidis must have had wings on their Epo vials. Display certainly worthy of the best of Festina at that time. Abraham Alano, 6th overall, abandoned in terrible pain after a crash in the Obisque, where a ball of flesh, well, the size of a ping-pong ball, adorned his right buttock. Again, his tour project would end, and he would start a new project for the Vuelta a España, a project that will be our next video, so subscribe to the channel now if you want to see that show just a few days down the road. On the way up the Col de Port, the weeping Frenchman Stéphane Hurlot, FDJ, attacked alongside the former donkey Andrea Tafi, but despite being 9th overall, Telekom didn't even blink. Of course, neither Hurlot or Tafi nor Gomez could get close to a stratospheric Roland Meyer. This rider, with only 2 professional victories in the time trial discipline to his name, had not won any place of honour for 3 years, and yet suddenly there he was, on his way to victory in the Tour de France, in the Pyrenees of all places. He topped the Col de Port with 2 minutes advantage over the Hurlot trio and 4 minutes ahead of the bunch. But then there was a big change in the main group. For Telekom were no longer the ones leading the group. No, the Mercatone Uno of the doped bald man who today would take off his bandana at the foot of the Plateau de Bay. The men were led by Giuseppe Martinelli, and they reduced the distance to the radioactive Meyer to 3 minutes. And then they also had a small stroke of fortune. The yellow jersey suffered a puncture just 1 kilometre from the pass, and he would have to accelerate like hell with his teammates. Well, all his teammates except Bjarne Riis, who in this Tour de France was a long way from being supportive towards Jan. The bald-headed Dane now was only thinking of forming his own cycling team once he retired, and he'd lost all feelings of attachment to the team that had made him champion in 1996. This was something that the always good-natured Ulle never reproached him for. But Udo Boltz and George Tochnik did a good job of closing the gap, and after Jan's acceleration, the bunch, led by the whoremonger Bogard, decided to wait for the leader as a sign of respect. And only the doped Spaniard Manuel Beltran of Benesto attacked, looking for a stage win following Alano's abandonment, but that was when the German had reached the group again. The Andalusian's pace was good, and he soon caught Hurlot's trio. But behind, the Cesenatico rider had taken off his bandana, for he was going to tackle the Plateau de Bay, for he was ready to humiliate Jan Ullrich. With 13 kilometres to go, Pantani attacked hard, and only brave Ulle and Jalabert dared to try to chase him, but of course to no avail. Pantani gradually escaped, and in just a few seconds he swept tricky Beltran up, and the duo of Ullrich and Jalabert returned to the main group. It was the moment when we saw again that Jan was not a very tactically intelligent guy, and he seemed to rely simply on the brute force that his doping since his teenage years in East Germany had given him. Firstly, he was unable to convince his own teammate Bjarne Riis that he should work for the yellow jersey. And secondly, he was unable to find other collaborators within the main group. He was just pulling himself, on his own, always him. Nobody was helping. And after the effort of the puncture and the effort to follow Pantani, well, Christina Jonsson's boyfriend just kept moving away from the group. A group formed by Ullrich, the now not-so-unknown Renero, his teammate Julich, and Pierpoli, Escartin, Jalabert, Riis, Leblanc, and the whoremonger Bogard. With 10 kilometres to go, the radioactive Meyer was only 1 minute ahead of Pantani and 1 minute 40 seconds ahead of Ullrich's group. It was clear that the Pirate was going to catch the new Cofidis star climber, but his teammates behind didn't think so. Neither Bobby Julich nor Christoph Renero handed over to Jan Ullrich, a cowardly tactic on the part of the American and a stupid one on the part of the German. They should have reminded him of the jersey given to Desbiens a few days earlier, but Ullrich didn't say anything. Jan showed again that he didn't have his strength of 1997 when the rhythm was not continuous. He accelerated and then he saw that no one was giving him any help at all, so he slowed down again, with a noticeable gesture of tiredness on his face. Only Piepoli, perhaps looking for a contract for 1999, behaved like a mercenary to the chagrin of the Italian tifosi, who now only had eyes for the bald Mercatone rider. He finally managed to catch Meyer a few minutes later and then rode solo to the finish line. His gap to the leaders' group increased to 52 seconds with 5 kilometers to go. A gap that was growing at almost 10 seconds per kilometer, despite the help received from the TV bikes for Ullrich's group. The trees disappeared at more than 1,500 meters of altitude, and Pantani's bald head shone like that bare mountain, while behind Bogard, he helped a little bit, but it was help that wasn't going to make any difference. They would never receive any help from the 2 Cofidis riders who were stuck in a place where they never thought they'd be just a few days earlier, but they were behaving, well, like 2 dirty little ticks, as if they were unable to receive any air in their face for a single second. This would never have happened with Lalande or with Guimard in that team of dopers. Minutes later, Pantani crossed the Plateau de Bay as the winner. A new triumph on a new summit for the Tour, crossing the line at full speed with his arms in the air and knowing that he was the best in the mountains. The Swiss Meyer took second place on the stage, 1 minute and 26 seconds behind, and then just afterwards came, like a Ferrari, Bobby Julich, who had had the nerve to attack Ullrich with 150 meters to go to the finish line. Together with the whoremonger Bogard, Piepoli, Escartine, and the even less unknown teammate Rinero. That's right, the leader had given up. He came in 7 seconds later after a superhuman effort. Now, what would have happened if Cofidis had dared to attack him a little earlier? Maybe Julich could have been leader of the Tour. But no, he was still second at 1 minute and 11 seconds to Ullrich. Ullrich had saved the day as best he could. Galibier was third in GC, already crossed the line 30 seconds after Ullrich, with another Cofidis rider, the carrier pigeon Kevin Livingston. But now he was already on equal time with Pantani, who continued his comeback. He was only 3 minutes behind the Telekom leader. Bjarne Riis, for his part, said goodbye to the GC by losing more than 5 minutes to Pantani. Would he now finally work for Ullrich? These are questions that needed to be answered. But first came the rest day. Ah, yes. Unfortunately, it was anything but restful. On the strictly competitive side, everyone was already focused on an Ullrich-Pantani duel. Walter Godefroot didn't hesitate to call Pantani Pinocchio after his pre-tour statements, saying that he was there just for stage wins after his Giro success. Walter hinted that he wanted to buy off the Mercatone rider, giving him 2 or even 3 mountain stages in exchange for not making hard attacks against them. But the pirate wasn't a jackass like Ullrich. He refused any deal with Telekom. Seasoned directors like Manolo Saez told the cameras that those dirty Germans were going to regret leaving Pantani only 5 minutes behind after the flat stages, and now the odds were starting to tip in the Pirates' favour. However, the big news was coming from outside the race. Just when it seemed that we'd forgotten about Festina and Richard Virenque, the tears of hypocrisy of the dyed and doped and the dyed-doped would nevertheless begin to flow again, because there were arrests on the rest day. That same morning, the 9 Festina riders, together with the second directors Miguel Moreno and Michel Gros, were called to testify, tricked by Jean-Marie Leblanc. Instead of being interrogated like Roussel and Rijkaard, they were subject to continuous humiliation by the gendarmerie. The cyclists were forced to strip naked, and they were locked in cages that smelled of piss and shit, and only had 1 sandwich to eat all day. The first to lose his temper was obviously Mr. Magoo, Alex Zuller. After being confronted by a prison officer and then attended to by several policemen, he not only lost his clothes and his bed, but also his glasses. And then they stuck a finger up his back passage to look for doping substances which they thought might be concealed in the Swiss cyclist's darkest orifice. Willy Voet and Bruno Roussel had already told the police what they wanted to hear, that they were doping like pigs, and that everyone in the world was doing it. And the cyclists had unwittingly turned up just for human carnage. After being tested for hair doping and testing positive for testosterone 4 months earlier, Dufaux, Armin Meyer, Laurent Brochard, Neil Stevens, Christophe Moreau, Didier Roux and Alex Zuller eventually confessed to doping with EPO. And, in the case of Mr. Magoo, he also confessed to doping practices with the Once team, which had already been investigated by the French police in March during Pyrenees, but all to no avail. Only 2 titans held out. These Iron Men were Richard Virenque and, of course, Pascal Hervé. Pascal always denied that he doped, even though he was already doing it in the amateur ranks. When, 5 or 6 years older than his competitors, he humiliated youngsters under 20 and always made sure that he had a considerable arsenal of doping substances. Both of these riders had platinum blonde hair, and that helped them to test negative in the anti-doping control's hair analysis that they did under the custody of the gendarmerie. Both of them even had the balls to file a lawsuit against the media and the Tour de France itself, besmirching their honour. Honour they didn't really have, but so they went ahead. They carried it as a flag, defending their innocence above all things. But that was not the end of the doping show for that day, no. French police leaked to the press that the TVM team, a collection of Dutch classics riders and hustlers who had scored a stage win with Blijlevens already in this tour, was now under investigation after 2 team mechanics were found in Reims in March with 104 vials of EPO in the trunks of their vehicles. Of course, the new cleanliness advocate, Jean-Marie Leblanc, knew all about this police raid. But, as all major cycling race organisers do these days, he kept quiet, and he said he knew nothing, despite being practically the top dog of the sport in that rotten country. On the same rest day, while they were digging into Zuller's deepest recesses, the police dug into the recesses of the TVM team hotel in Pamiers. And again they found a huge amount of doping substances and masking substances. This created a tremendous panic in the peloton, as Bjarne Riis himself recounted. Riders from many teams started hiding all their pills and vials. They were flushing syringes down the toilets and burning evidence. They were paying citizens to hide their dirty doping tests. The panic only increased when the investigating judge in Reims ordered the arrest in Foire of Kees Priem and André Michailov, director and doctor of the Dutch team. And the hypocrite Jean-Marie Leblanc could not think of anything else to say to the press except TVM would be expelled from the Tour if they were found to have broken the rules. Something that, of course, he knew all too well. That is to say, they would be expelled if it came to light that they had doped, and therefore damaged the image of supposed cleanliness that the race enjoyed. To end the hectic rest day, the TV channel France Deux broadcast a nightly report where a journalist had sneaked into the A6 team hotel and found syringes and empty bottles and other strange products in the rubbish at the cyclists' rooms. This last fact was key to understanding the events that would occur the day after in Tarascon. The cyclists were to ride a 222-kilometre stage from Tarascon to Le Cap d'Agde. But then they decided to go on strike to defend their dignity in the face of police abuse and pressure from the organisers and the press. There were several cyclists who took on the role of union leaders. Luc Leblanc, Marco Pantani, Jackie Durand, Max Chiandri, and especially Laurent Jalabert. As French champion and best overall national qualifier, the Once rider was fed up with police chases, and he ordered the rest of the peloton to sit on the road, not to turn a single pedal stroke that day. Because, according to the doped-up world time trial champion, no one was talking about the race, they were only talking about doping. Jaja's director, Fat Balbas, confronted the organisation harshly, saying that Almery Sports only thought of Almery Sports and they weren't thinking about the cyclists. He was furious, he was pissed off like a killer whale in the middle of the ocean. The athletes weren't too keen on the measure taken by Hein Verbruggen from Havana. the immediate implementation of a health card for cyclists, a kind of biological passport where the UCI would know at all times where and when the athletes were while they were doping in their preparations. Jean-Marie Leblanc got really nervous. He knew that if the stage were not disputed, then possibly the Tour de France would have to be cancelled at that very moment. And so he decided to behave like a real mafioso after more than an hour and a half of sitting by the cyclists. He went after the team directors and threatened them with terrible legal and sporting consequences if they did not order their riders to ride the stage. Now, these directors didn't want to be the new Bruno Roussel. Very soon they were quaking in their tight leopard skin thongs. And so they ordered their riders to race again, and in some cases they threatened them by breaking contracts or reducing their pay. In addition, 2 of the teams ignored the rest of the cyclists and came to Jean-Marie Leblanc's defense. These were the always clean Gan of Roger Leger, who was looking for the support of Omeri Sports to gain new sponsorship for 1999, and the Telekom team, who wanted to have favoured treatment continuing from the organisation for Ulle. And also Bjarne Riis had a personal interest because he was looking to construct a new Danish team. And as always, the bald rat saw an ideal opportunity to achieve his own interests. These 2 teams started the stage on their own, and other riders just had to follow their wheel. Pantani, Luc Leblanc and Jalabert were the last ones to return, totally enraged. Especially furious was the Once team rider, who launched an unbridled attack as soon as he reached the bunch, with his brother Nicolas from Cofidis and TVM's Dutchman Bart Voskamp. TVM, of course, being currently under the microscope of the French police. Laurent Jalabert worked hard with tremendous fury on the flats, and this leading trio reached an incredible 5 minutes lead, placing the Frenchman as virtual leader of the race. But Telekom, along with Marc Madieu's FDG saboteurs, went to work as they had never done before, this time including Riis himself, who wasn't working for the leader Ullrich, but rather to catch the oh-so-evil Jalabert. Jalabert abandoned the breakaway with 53 kilometers to go, but now racing was underway, and despite the delay at the start, the riders were back on schedule. With 32k to go, they caught the duo of Voskamp and Nicolas Jalabert, but the fire of the strikers was far from being extinguished. Several men from the teams most involved in the revolt tried to break away solo. First, there was the doped Italian Rossano Brasi of Polti, followed by 2 classic suspects for this type of breakaway, Thierry Gouvenou of Big Mat and Jackie Durand of Casino. The winner in Montauban was totally on fire. In the morning, he had been one of the greatest defenders of the cycling collective, and the luckiest doped rider in history was now one of the most combative men of that Tour de France. He quickly left Gouvenou behind and went solo on the flat at full speed, riding harder than he had done 6 years earlier in Flanders. However, even Ipo couldn't handle that much uncontrolled power, and although he came in first on the Flamme Rouge, Lucky Jackie was totally exhausted. The current Eurosport commentator tried his best, but he was caught 400 metres from the finish. And then in the sprint, Jan Svorada worked like never before for his teammate Tom Steels, and he won with ease over the always clean Gan, Francois Simon. A second victory for the Mappe rider, but it seemed to matter little to the press, and even less to the riders present there. In fact, much more interesting were the declarations of the leader Jan Ullrich himself. Of course, he was forced into it by his directors Walter Godefroot and Rudy Prevenage. They didn't want to lose their privileges. He assured everyone, dressed in yellow, that in order to bring peace, he would give up the financial prizes that he won in the Tour to improve anti-doping controls. Of course, it is not that the lover of strangling women was a champion of cleanliness in cycling. Simply, the Telekom team knew perfectly well that there is no better way to mask a positive than to have bought the laboratories. And the show would only continue on the next day. 196 kilometers, finishing Carpentras without the Mont Ventoux, but with the Col de Mur near the finish. That awaited the riders, but again the spotlight was off the race. In the morning, the organisation gathered the directors and doctors and one rider per team at the Hôtel Mercure to explain the new UCI measure and ensure that the Tour would even make it to Paris. Of course, Ein Verbruggen was not there. He was still partying in Cuba. but his French deputy and vice president Daniel Barle, he was there. The riders and directors, except for the always clean Roger Leger, rejected the introduction of the UCI health card, and although Bjarne Riis sided with Leblanc, the majority quickly dismissed those dinosaurs who suddenly wanted to avoid linking cycling with doping, even though they'd known for years what was going on with EPO in the peloton. They only managed to agree that the health card would not be introduced for the 1998 season, and that it would at least be discussed at the end of the year for possible implementation in 1999, which, as we know, would not happen. However, for the time being, Jean-Marie Leblanc had won the Battle of Tarascon. Not only did he have some riders and teams on his side, he also had the directors of enemy teams under the veil of his threats. And they had riders under their threats. However, the most controversial tour in history would still have more murky, dark episodes. But as for the stage itself, a large breakaway was formed, almost from the start, with Salt Lake City guinea pig Marty Jemison of US Postal, the weeping Stefan Erlo of FDJ, the walking meme Vicente Garcia Acosta of Banesto, the donkey-turned-racehorse Andrea Tafi and his teammate Daniele Nardello. For Joe Rogan, he is the real winner of the 1999 Tour, and who are we to argue with Joe? Oh, and then there was the doped sprinter Nicola Minali of Riso Scotti, there was Cipollini's ghost pair Massimiliano Mori of Seiko, there was the strange Jumbo-Visma duo of Den Bakker and Morenhout. The previous day's second place Francois Simon of the always clean Gan, and the doped rider who today would compete under another country's flag, Sergei Ivanov of TVM. This group had reached a very large advantage over the bunch, and between them they would now play out for the victory. But behind, just at the start of the slopes of the Col de Mur, the incendiary Luc Leblanc jumped out of the bunch alone, and he made Telekom nervous, very nervous. Leblanc had been one of the leaders of the Tarascon sit-in, and his main interest was to make those dirty Protestant Germans surrender to his Catholic, neighbourhood-defending, communal brotherhood ideas. He had no quarrel with Ulle. He just wanted Riis and those guys in pink to go down in misery. And in fact, as they climbed the Col de Mur, once again the Bald Dame was working for his own interests, unlike in the previous days. Ahead, Garcia Acosta launched a dangerous attack to take revenge for Alano's mishaps, and he looked for the breakaway, but quickly the former donkey Taffy took his teammate Nardello on his wheel, and only they, Erlo, Jemison, and the platinum blonde Morenhout topped the climb. Leblanc was 2.5 minutes behind, while the peloton, where Riis now reminded Cofidis that they had to work to pay back the Desbiens affair, they accelerated and cut the Catholics' gap from 1.5 minutes to just 30 seconds. On the flat road to Carpentras, Leblanc eventually gave up, but he'd hurt the Telekom, and he made it clear that this war was not over. On reaching Carpentras, Erlo launched the sprint. But then freakishly, a piece of paper stuck to his face, and he couldn't see the finish line clearly, and so Nardello overtook him and took the lead to contest the sprint. The 6 riders laid out horizontally in front of the finish line as if it were an athletics race, and we watched a beautiful sprint where Joe Rogan's favourite surprisingly held off the kidney punch of Garcia Acosta and his teammate and favourite Taffy, who was once again left with honey on his horse's lips. Out of competition, there were several moves that would change the cycling landscape for the following season. Jean-Marie Leblanc obtained for the always clean Leger the sponsorship of the Crédit Agricole Bank, while the ONCE director, FAT Balbas, saw the ideal occasion to remove Leger from the presidency of the Sports Directors Association and propose himself for the following season. This move was supported by the UCI itself, as it would give them more decision-making power over Omari Sports. Seeing this move by Manolo Saez, Jean-Marie Leblanc decided that his new enemies in the Tour would be the ONCE team. Precisely one of his former cyclists, Alex Zuller, gave an interview from his mansion where he publicly told how he had known about EPO years ago, when he was part of that team of blind and doped riders. Without directly mentioning Fat Balbas or any of his teammates, he said that in 1992 he was informed that with this magical substance he can compete at the highest level without any problems. Of course, the problem was much more deeply rooted in the peloton than many people thought. Even the whistleblower Cyril Guimard claimed that the main problem in the peloton was the doctors, who now had more power than the directors. And he was partially right. A new day of medium mountains awaited the riders before the Alps. 187 kilometers between Valréas and Grenoble, with the Col de Rousset at the halfway point as the hardest point. And it was another day ripe for breakaways, especially with the intense 33 degrees Celsius temperature. Eagerly lining up was a hyperactive Léon Van Bon, the Portuguese rider from Banesto, Orlando Rodriguez, who wanted to avenge the soldier Olano, the always clean Stuart O'Grady in a tour where he was shining. There was Cipollini's party friend Giuseppe Calcaterra of Saeco. There was the confidant and former race leader Laurent Desbiens, and the US postal carrier pigeon Peter Meinhardt, that Danish guy who was replaced by Jan Ullrich in the 1996 tour at Telekom. These escapees built up a lead of close to 9 minutes over the peloton, which was chilling before the arrival of the Alps, and once again Cofidis proved to be much more than a team capable of fighting for the GC. Desbiens attacked with 2 kilometers to the finish line, and very cleverly Rodriguez stuck to his wheel. He'd shown his power, and if he wanted to, he would have played for the victory in the sprint with the Portuguese. But greed got the better of him, and by not working, they were caught by the rest of the escapees. The fastest of whom was undoubtedly the always clean O'Grady. And so Cipollini's launchman, Calcaterra, decided to make a dirty manoeuvre. He got in front of the Australian as if he were preparing for a sprint for the legendary Pavarotti. But when the doped-up member of a clean team pulled out his blonde hair to overtake the Italian giant, he tried to close him out in a dirty way, which ended with the disqualification for the grey-haired Calcaterra and a stage win for the polytoxicomaniac O'Grady. The second stage win for the always clean Gan, and the second success for O'Grady after his yellow days in the Tour, all of which catapulted him to fame and allowed him to earn enough income to win a doped Paris-Roubaix. Now, the rest of them arrived more than 10 minutes behind the Aussie, but it didn't matter. G-Day had arrived, the day of the Galibier, the most epic day in the history of the Tour de France, in sporting terms, in the last 40 years. It's precisely at this point in 1998 that the strange extra-sporting situations converged with the strictly sporting ones. Jan Ullrich was the leader of the Tour, but Telekom was a real hotbed of contention in those days. For many of his colleagues, the Germans were sellouts to the power of Jean-Marie Leblanc, and moreover, they were completely scared of the measures of the prosecutor, Patrick Kiel, a very dangerous guy who saw in the Festina Affair an opportunity to become a millionaire and gain even more notoriety within his profession. And so he bypassed the wise recommendations of Jean-Marie Leblanc and sent police and gendarmes to the hotels of the cycling teams to search absolutely all their belongings. Bjarne Riis himself had thrown away all his EPO syringes, flushing their contents down the toilet and eliminating all evidence that they had ever existed. But he was still unable to sleep. So only hours after O'Grady's triumph, he called the Danish TV channel TV2 and went live to lie to the entire audience in his country. First, he told the truth, assuring that he had never tested positive. Then he criticised the Danish press, said he was tired of being called a coward, and he lied like a pig, claiming that he had never doped during his career. Jan Ullrich, without his beloved beers and without any concubines to give love to, he didn't know what to do in that tense situation either. However, the poly-drug addict and poly-operated Marco Pantani knew that he was going to finish off those German sellouts. He had, of course, the support of union leader Laurent Jalabert, who had given him the contacts of cyclists from Spanish teams, such as Banesto and Kelme, to help him carry out his strategy of dynamiting the Tour de France on the road. There was also the rebellious Luc Leblanc. The Polti rider was fed up with the organisation, fed up with the French press that treated him like a pariah because he belonged to an Italian team, and he wanted those dirty journalists to talk about sporting feats and not just doping and cheating, so he also decided to support Pantani. These two opposing blocks, led by Jan Ullrich and Marco Pantani, would face each other in an epic duel in the Alps over 3 stages. The first of which was a mountainous course between Grenoble and Les Deux Alpes of 189 kilometres, with the Quad Affair, the Galibier on the Telegraph side that had not been climbed since 1993, and the tough ski resort of Les Deux Alpes as a climax. The final altitude finish for that edition, and perhaps the most favourable stage for climbers in the whole Tour de France, and therefore the one most feared by Telekom, as they knew that they only had the support of GAN, FDJ and Rabobank. And, except for the Weeping Urlo and the Hamburger Bogart, they hardly had any men for the high mountains. Maybe they could count on the collaboration of Cofidis, but considering that Bobby Julich was really close to Jan Ullrich in the GC, they couldn't be considered faithful allies either. Oh, friends, let the show begin. The day dawned extremely cold and extremely rainy, swinging violently from 33 degrees Celsius of the previous day to only 4 degrees at the top of the Galibier at more than 2,600 metres. And so the protagonists decided to at least begin the day with a mood of calm and tranquility. There were just a few moves from Erik Zabel for the green jersey points alongside his teammate Rolf Aldag, an Asics Oscar Pozzi and the legendary Jacques Durand. A strange quartet that started the Quad Affair in the lead until Cofidis sent newly converted climber Roland Meyer to work until the Telekom men were caught. His pace was so criminal that he reduced the peloton to just 55 riders on the first ramps of La Quad Affair. And then the Germans and Pozzi were caught on the first landing of the climb. The escapees Aldag and Zabel set to work at a much more manageable pace than the Swiss Cofidis, who was certainly much more belligerent than Godefroot and Pevenage had expected. In fact, soon after, Bondu sent the already well-known Christophe Rinero to attack. But this attack was quickly answered by Udo Bolts, and that seemed to calm down those phone lenders a little bit. Marco Pantani, dressed today with his pirate bandana covering his bald head from the rain, suffered a snag that made him lose a few metres, but he soon regained his place in the bunch. Led by Roland Meyer, the peloton climbed until, in the final metres of the climb, the king of the mountains and dangerous rider controller, Rodolfo Massi, crested it ahead of Laurent Jalabert and the very well-known Christophe Rinero and the whoremonger Michael Bogart. It had been a much more nervous climb than expected for Jan Ullrich. He practically jumped at every Cofidis attempt. It would remain that way on the descent too. Harmless Big Mat's Philippe Bourguignon's attack was followed by far more dangerous riders, including the very familiar Christophe Rinero, the drug dealer Rodolfo Massi, Galician doped mayor Marcus Serrano of Kelme, the Festina drug procurer Peter Farazine of Lotto, and the British caffeine doper Max Chiandri of FDJ. This sextet had built up a lead of more than 3 minutes en route to the Galibier. Telekom could have let them get more of a gap, but keep in mind that Rinero was only 6 minutes behind Ullrich in the GC, and King of the Mountains Massi and doped-up Mayor Serrano had 9 minutes, so they couldn't let them get too much time. However, the Germans didn't take into account the Spanish climber from Kelme, one of the men with whom Marco Pantani would share a doctor, and with whom he had spoken the day before to be a dangerous element for the telephonists. And so the riders arrived at the Telegraph. And when the favourites started the first ramps of the pass, the plan of the anti-Telekom, anti-ASO rebels began with a very hard attack by the always unstable and unpredictable Luc Leblanc. So powerful and so sustained that it burned almost all of Jan Ullrich's teammates, to the extent that it had to be Bjarne Riis himself who worked for his leader for the first time in the whole tour, and he held back the Polti rider. Swiss guinea pig Meyer attacked straight away, and then again Telekom, who had been desperate for a quiet climb, had to jump on his wheel. These two attacks by Leblanc and Meyer ended up leaving the bunch in a real old mess, and only Udo Bolts and Bjarne Riis were there to support the yellow jersey. Rudy Pevenage barked like crazy from the car that Bolts should impose a strong pace to avoid further attacks from so far back, and with this move the main peloton was down to just 36 riders. One of the first important men to give way was the Union leader Laurent Desbiens, who until then was doing a brilliant tour, but as always he was stuck in the high mountains in the Gallic round. And this pushed Marco Pantani to third place on GC. Meanwhile, up front, it was the now very, very well-known Christophe Renero who was getting the air and the water in his face for practically the entire climb, and he did so with an absolutely hysterical, histrionic pace, especially for someone who'd finished 115th in the previous edition of the Grand Boucle. Thierry Bourguignon and Max Chiandry were quickly dropped, while the Galician mayor, Peter Farazin, and the very dangerous Rodolfo Massi were glued to the Cofidis rider's wheel without doing a single turn. Suddenly, a very worried Rudy P approached Udo Bolts to tell him to slow down the pace that he himself had previously ordered to be increased, and all this because the doped Rolf Aldag was approaching the group of favourites. This was seen as an act of weakness, and Pantani's friend and inveterate party animal Jose Maria Jimenez of Banesto attacked furiously and managed to open up a gap on the bunch. Everyone could see that Telekom were not in a party mood, possibly marked by the large number of syringes they had to flush down the toilets during the police inspections, which made many of the anti-ASO riders want to give them a fight. Again, the Swiss guinea pig Meyer and Luc Leblanc tried once more after Jimenez's move, and Riis, who was clear that Polti's Frenchman shouldn't get away, ordered the Telekom to work hard again in order to catch them. Despite all this toing and froing, all these attacks and counter-attacks, the pace of the incredibly well-known Christophe Renero was so good that he was still 2.5 minutes ahead of the favourites, and he'd already dropped Farazin with a constancy in pedalling, a style that was unworthy of someone who was not doped. At the top of the telegraph, the drug dealer Rodolfo Massi passed at the head of the trio. That was his only turn until then. Jimenez would pass by at 2 minutes and the bunch at 3, showing that Renero's climb was going absolutely superbly, and the Telekom were becoming stunned after the attacks of Meyer and Leblanc. The situation was becoming tense. So tense that, on the start of the Galibier, the 2-kilometre break after the telegraph, the bald Dane himself was put to the head of the bunch to slow things down so that Galibier and Aldag returned. In this softer part of the climb, Serrano dropped from the leading group. Some say because of a mechanical problem, others because he was waiting for the attack of their leader, Fernando Escartin. And then in the bunch there were characters like Bielitas Casero, Tugboat, or the walking meme Vicente Garcia Acosta. They reached an advantage over the group of favourites. They passed the Bridge of Valois on 4 minutes behind the duo formed by Renero and Massi. But this was only the calm before the storm. As the ramp steepened at more than 2,000 metres of altitude on the Plan d'Achat, again there was another hard attack by Luc Leblanc. It left the group of favourites shivering, bursting the Swiss guinea pig Meyer and Udo Bolts, so that once more it had to be the 1996 Tour champion who did the work, reduced the distance of the former French world champion. Again, Telekom were burning their ships, and their rivals saw it very early. They saw exactly what was happening. It was the faithful client of Michele Ferrari and later Eufemiano Fuentes, Fernando Escartin, who launched a sustained attack. Not as powerful as Luc Leblanc, but much more interesting than his flag-raising to stop competitions in much better weather conditions than those of July 1998. Riis didn't move in the face of this attack as he had in 97. He still wanted to ride a false rhythm, but it was enough to make the crazy Luc Leblanc go on another uncontrolled attack, wanting to blast Telekom until they let him go. The old bald Dane could no longer do it without his blood transfusions that had brought him glory. And finally, on the 4th or 5th attempt, Luc was breaking away from the group. The whoremonger Michael Bogard, who was 1 minute ahead of the French Catholic on GC, could not stand this move, and despite his loyalty to Omeri Sports, the Ford Escort user decided to move in the face of Riis's inoperativeness. As if imbued by the multiple glasses of Ballantines that he drank, Jan Ullrich again took the lead at the head of the bunch to pick up the pace in an impressive manner, as if back to his 97 prime. There he was, shifting a couple of sprockets and launching himself towards the 3 escapees. Bobby Julich, the tick, stuck to his wheel, and then Marco Pantani and Giuseppe Di Grandi caught up with the German at their own pace. Ullrich managed to catch the three escapees, but then he ran out of companions, and everyone wondered why he was jumping in the lead in the face of attacks from people who were so far behind on GC. In addition, Big Jan did not continue his criminal pace as he would have done the year before. Instead, he simply slowed down again, perhaps belatedly realizing what a mistake it was to be doing all this without teammates. Seeing the situation, the formerly timorous Escartine attacked again, showing all his cleanliness, and he managed to get a significant gap, especially considering that his teammate Serrano was a few minutes ahead of him. The number one rider was only supported by Julich's Cofidis. Who knows what Riis had promised them for not attacking? Even the doped gringo Kevin Livingston appeared from behind to work for Ullrich and ruin the breakaway for his teammate Raniero. After several meters of impasse, Luc Leblanc launched his umpteenth attack, looking to annoy Ullrich, and the German jumped on his wheel, taking the pirate with him. With this attack, the Polti Catholic also left Julich without any teammates. The top two riders on GC were finally isolated. And then came the magic moment, the crowning moment of the Tour, when the Epoists fleeing from police raids and inspections. It was the P moment on D-Day. Marco Pantani's legendary attack without looking back, 47 kilometers from the finish line and 5 kilometers from the summit of the Galibier, wearing sunglasses in the rain and fog. The bald man with aesthetic complexes was at the peak of his sporting performance at 28 years of age, and Ullrich was stiff, unable to move after this oh-so-complete move by the Mercatone leader. Luc Leblanc did try to get onto Pantani's wheel, but he was tired from the multiple attacks, and so the French pyromaniac also ended up saying goodbye to this new rock star of cycling. It was the last time we saw the Catholic in the leading positions of a cycling competition, so now we implore you to leave a like for this beloved doped rider. Pantani's attack had literally knocked Ullrich out. He was climbing the Galibier at a killer pace, to the extent that in just a few seconds he caught up with Fernando Escartine and left him stranded as if he were a third division sprinter. The crowd went crazy in the rain. The French, without their beloved doped Virenque as a reference, wanted the combative Pantani to win. They thought, in their ignorance, that he raced clean and that everything he showed was the result of his talent. And that's why the comparisons among those present were those with authentic legends of antiquity, such as Fausto Coppi or Charlie Gaulle or Jesus of Nazareth. Pantani was ascending to the skies, with only 4 degrees Celsius temperature, and next to him, Ullrich looked like a fat and tired mortal. At least Jan always stood up for himself, and since he lost ground on bib number 21, our favourite cokehead showed big cojones and pedalled like a titan, while mediocrities like Bobby Julich and the Dutch escort lover, the top 10 seeker with no air in his face, De Grande, the bald Piepoli or the US postal Sputniks of Jean-Cyril Robin and Dariusz Baranovsky, well, they didn't work at all. They didn't do a single turn. Especially shameful was the attitude of Julich, who had before him the opportunity to show what he could do against a tired Ullrich, and still he didn't dare to move, showing that, well, he was a coward, and of course he didn't have the competitive gringo gene that we would see from La Lanza shortly afterwards. Ahead, Jimenez and Meyer Serrano had found themselves on the road and were catching up with the duo of Raniero and Massi, but behind them, Marco Pantani was closing in, oh so rapidly, as if he were climbing atop Mick Doohan's Honda NSR 500. The Italian's lead over Ullrich's group was growing, 30 seconds per kilometre from the race leader. The exceptionally well-known Raniero showed himself as the strongest of the leading group, attacking his 3 companions despite being all day in the air, and then at the head of the race. But behind came the Honda of Marco Pantani, with the gasoline at full throttle, taking the stickers off his rivals. Only Xavier Jimenez could chase the pirate, and he allowed himself the luxury of insulting an Oppi Omi fan who would not leave number 21 in peace. And thus, full of EPO, his veins bulging, Marco Pantani crested the Galibier in the lead of the race, without beating the record of Rominger from '93, and of course the later record of the very clean Vingegaard in 2023. 10 seconds later, Jimenez exhaustedly chased that doped bald man who was making an out-of-the-ordinary exhibition, and soon after came Runero, Escartin, Serrano and Massi. Almost 3 minutes behind came Jan Ullrich with his group of ticks, and he was about to lose the virtual leadership of the Tour. The third classified and union leader, Galibier, threw in the towel at that point when he crossed 9 minutes behind the pirate at the top of this Alpine colossus. But there was still the descent and the ascent of the Deux Alpes. It was so cold that even the unleashed Pantani stopped on one of the first bends of the descent to put on a rain jacket, something that Jimenez and the exceptionally well-known Runero took advantage of to catch him. Ullrich had put on his rain jacket before reaching the top. Julich copied Pantani and stopped on a bend after almost falling. He needed to get warm and think about why he hadn't attacked the yellow jersey. All these setbacks and the good work of number 1 helped Ullrich's group to catch Luc Leblanc and cut the gap to 2 minutes when they reached the road to Lauterre. The wind was against them and blowing very strongly, and the riders at the head of the race couldn't understand each other. The well-known Runero tried to escape alone without any sense, and Jimenez was unable to put on his rain jacket during the descent. However, when the 2 Kelme riders and the dealer Rodolfo Massi arrived at the head of the race, the situation changed drastically. The wards of Alvaro Pino and Ufe Fuentes knew full well that they had to work, with Maya Serrano showing their leader Escartin and Pantani that the anti-ASO pact could become a reality. Massi also went to work, possibly in exchange for money or whatever this mafioso was moving on. And then, between the work of Kelme and the mountain leader, the gap from Pantani's group to Ullrich's began to widen significantly. With 15 kilometers to go, the gap was now 3 minutes and 1 second, something which made the Mercatone rider the virtual leader of the GC. Ole kept looking for collaboration, but he was absolutely unable to find anyone willing to work with him, beyond a few token turns. The lead continued to grow, and when an unexpected and unfortunate event happened for the German champion, a puncture in his front wheel brought him to a sudden stop. And in addition, the Telekom mechanics were really clumsy and slow in changing the wheel, taking almost 40 seconds to get him back on the road. It was all that was missing for bib number 1. Tired after all his slimming, his lack of parties and his lack of alcohol, and the horror of having to flush all those good doping substances down the toilet and then receiving the hatred of his fellow riders, and that had actually been provoked by his teammate Bjarne Riis. It was the second time he'd punctured before a decisive climb, but now he had no time to get back on the wheel of the leading group, which meant he began to sink mentally. He knew he was losing the Tour at that very moment. On the first slopes of the final climb, the no longer timid Escartin took the lead of the group, but Pantani quickly handed over to him, increasing the pace, knowing that he could wear yellow on a legendary day, and with insulting ease he left those incredible dopers behind and headed for a 9-kilometer time trial climb to the finish line. 3.5 minutes behind the chasing group at the foot of the pass, 4 minutes behind the leader. Poor Jan. And then, at that moment, without the presence of number 1, the mediocre Julich dared to attack. Now, for the record, we don't mind an attack in these circumstances, but you have to be a bad person to be protected behind the leader for the whole Tour de France and then attack him only when he's 30 seconds behind because of a mechanical problem. Cofidis had done everything right that day. Runero was escaping at the head of the race. Meyer blew away the Telekom. Livingston worked hard in the high mountains. But when their leader Julich was supposed to show his face, he hid under his shell like a turtle, only to come out when it was too late. Of course, with Francesco Casagrande, these situations would not have happened. The American mutant ninja turtle had grown strong thanks to Cofidis' spying and his insulting medical preparation. Now he was leaving the group with the whoremonger Bogart following his wheel for the entire climb, about 10 meters behind number 135. Behind, Jan Ullrich became increasingly slow and heavy, as if he was on his first training ride in Fuerteventura with 92 kilos of body weight in January. The crisis was so great that Udo Bolts and Bjarne Riis, who were practically lost at that point, managed to catch him and at least help him in such a painful situation. It was the last day that Ulle would wear yellow in the Tour. Just 12 short months previously, the champion that everyone predicted would surpass 5 wins seemed to be giving up for good, and he wasn't even able to keep up with his teammates, who had to reduce their pace every few minutes for the lovable German to keep up with them. However, Pantani was going faster and faster, accelerating towards the finish line, and with 5 kilometers to go, he was already more than 4.5 minutes ahead of Bobby J and almost 6 minutes ahead of an exhausted Jan Ullrich. Differences that continued to increase. Pantani needed to take as much advantage as possible over the German, because he knew he wasn't a mediocre rider like the Cofidis rivals, and there was still a flat time trial to come, where the Telekom rider could make up some of that lost gap. Standing on the bike, he went sprinting over the final meters of the stage, and it was clear he had given 100% of himself to achieve his goal, to humiliate Omeri Sports and place himself as the leader of world cycling, the guy that everyone would respect and follow his word as if he were now, yes, Jesus of Nazareth. Paying a respectful homage to this fictional historical character, the bald man with the scarf on his head crossed the line with his arms outstretched, relieved after the incredible effort he had made. Almost 2 minutes later, the surprise package came in, and over the last meters, the reborn Rodolfo Massi overtook Escartin thanks to the magic power of drugs, and he increased his gap over Rinero for the classification of the King of the Mountains. 1 minute later came the Frenchman. He wasn't even stopped by his director Bondu to help Julich. The Cofidis circus was absolutely pitiful at this stage, and although the mediocre Bobby entered with the Hup subscriber Bogart almost 6 minutes behind Pantani, the gap between him and the new leader was greater than the gap had been at the beginning of the stage. It failed miserably, despite remaining second on GC. Riders such as Maya Serrano at 6 minutes and the group of mediocre, among which were Bielitas Casero, a reborn Swiss guinea pig, the doped son of Eddie Merckx, the top 10 seekers De Grande and Nardello, the bald Piepli, the doped Beltran, and the strange US postal Robin and Baranovsky at 6 minutes and 46 seconds. Time went on, the clock kept ticking, and still no trace of Jan. In normal conditions, he should have entered with this group of doped riders. Even Riis's friend, Bo Hamburger, crossed the finish line at 8 minutes 30. And yet, still no sign of Jan. And then he came in with his face unhinged, as if he'd been punched in the face by Logan Paul. And along with his teammates, Riis and Bolts, they were 9 minutes almost behind Pantani. He did so amid whistles and boos from the French public, who now suddenly hated the combative, drunken German rider, not so much for himself, but for being part of that dirty corporate enterprise that was the Telekom team. Pantani had changed the Tour in just 47 magical kilometres. 47 magical kilometres full of rain and EPO, and he was already 3 minutes and 53 seconds ahead of Julich, 4 minutes 14 ahead of Escartin, and almost 6 minutes ahead of Jan Ullrich. It was a defiant act of rebellion, a defence of the sport of cycling itself as a spectacle, as a fireworks show, but one that was capable of entertaining the spectator for hours. However, it was to no avail, as we would see days later. Off the roads, the president of the International Olympic Committee, the Franquist dinosaur Juan Antonio Samaranch, said in front of the cameras that doping was simply that which endangered the health of athletes. Therefore, he was defending Festina and all the dopers of this tour, and we imagine all those doped by Dr. Fuentes for the Spanish in the 1992 Olympic Games. These words, out of common sense, were applauded by the directors of the Spanish cycling teams. Something really strange, since, according to some of them, their teams are the cleanest in the peloton of their epocha, and they didn't know anything about those scoundrels who tested positive in anti-doping controls. Spaniards riding in Spain, as you can see. The next day we had a new alpine stage of 204 kilometres between Vizille and Albertville, and where, for the first time, the boy who enjoyed attacking his rivals 10 years previously in the Italian hills would now have to defend himself as a true doped rider against his pink and white jerseyed German rival. 4 passes would be climbed in the first 115 kilometres. The first category Col de la Porte, Col de la Coucheron, the Col de Granier, and the second category Col du Grand Coucheron. With 44 kilometres to go, the cyclists would climb the very hard Col de la Madeleine on its hardest side. So, once again, we were facing a decisive stage. The stage of revenge. With only 10 kilometres gone, crybaby Stefan Erlo and doped German Rolf Aldag jumped out of the group, and soon after, Asics Fabio Roscioli and Lotto's Kazakh underdog Andrei Teteriuk joined them, for a much calmer day for the bunch, though at least over the first few passes, compared to the previous day's thrashing. Even so, several riders decided to abandon on the Col de la Porte. There was Jose Maria Jimenez, totally exhausted after the previous day's show, and the party that he must have held that night. Oh, there was the sprinter Jan Svorada, without the strength to continue, lacking the magic that had made Mappe fly in the sprints. Meanwhile, Mercatone's veterans Conti and Podenzana held off any attacks from Bjarne Riis or Bo Hamburger or Kevin Livingston, while allowing Erlo, Aldag and Teteriuk, with Roscioli already dropped, to acquire a 6-minute lead at the halfway point of the stage. In fact, it was the weeping Frenchman from FDJ who was in the lead all the time, while his breakaway companions did just enough to follow his wheel. When they reached the Col de la Madeleine, Erlo simply rode away at a breakaway pace, gaining a lead of 6 minutes and 20 seconds over the main field at the foot of the pass. And there, both the well-known Christophe Runero and Mercatone's Riccardo Forconi, doped at the Giro d'Italia 6 weeks earlier, set a high pace that reduced the peloton to just 32. This group no longer included Union leader Laurent Jalabert or Catholic firebrand Luc Leblanc. They were absolutely exhausted after the previous day's stage and without the necessary load of fireworks required to try to reach the podium in Paris. After 4 kilometres of climbing, the Swiss guinea pig of Cofidis took the lead with an acceleration so powerful that it lined the group out, single file, eliminating Forconi and leaving the bald Italian all alone. After this acceleration, there was a small lull, and the yellow jersey was quietly drinking when suddenly, as if hit by a totally unexpected bolt of lightning, with 15 kilometres to go to the top of the Madeleine, an attack so powerful that it looked like his bike was going to disintegrate under him, sent such an astonishing move that only Pantani and Escartine and the bald Piepoli, possibly the best pure climbers of that tour, could manage to keep up. We don't know the amount of watts that Jan developed, but in a few seconds, both Escartine and Piepoli ended up giving in to that incredible push from number 1. The yellow jersey followed his wheel as best he could, totally surprised by the power of a guy who showed that he certainly had a lot of balls, and who, of course, should never have been booed by that mediocre French public just a day earlier. The now self-styled pirate had to be content to follow the wheel of his partner in recreational activities in the snow, and despite being one of the bravest guys in the peloton, he didn't even do any work with Jan during the 15 kilometres up the Alpine Colossus. A few kilometres after the Telekom riders' bestial attack, Ullrich and Pantani caught up with Aldag and Teteriuk, a moment that was used by Ulle to rest for, at least 300 metres, until he again launched a spectacular attack at the exit of a curve. This made Pantani sweat and suffer as we had never seen before. Ullrich was furious, enraged. He knew that he had been humiliated the day before, and he knew that he was worth more than 99% of the riders who were competing there, and now he was going to prove it. The Cofidis of the mediocre Julich tried to get close to these two riders, but after the efforts of the Swiss guinea pig and the exceptionally well-known Runero, again the mediocre American didn't dare show his face. It was the doped Piepoli who worked and had Escartine, Julich, Bjarne Riis, Bogart and the very suspicious son of Eddy Merckx on his wheel. At the pass of the Jean-François de Longchamp, Erlo was easily overtaken by sometimes Bogart and Escartine, but never Julich. The leading duo finished 2 minutes and 13 seconds ahead of Piepoli, Bogart, Escartin, Riis, Julich and Axel Merckx, and a little later came Renero and Robin, Roland Meyer and Rodolfo Massi. 20 minutes behind was a sunken Luc Leblanc. He lost his privileged position in the Tour and he had to stop halfway up the climb because of kidney pains that had prevented him from pedalling properly and which had almost become chronic. Ullrich had attacked that day as if he were in a cobbled section of Paris-Roubaix, and he continued to lead the race during the descent without ever looking back. Totally isolated, totally alone in his world, it seemed that he had awakened from the lethargy in which he'd been hibernating for a year. Pantani only worked with him a little on the flats. On the climbs, well, he had his work cut out just to stay with that monster who'd apparently appeared out of nowhere, demonstrating the tremendous quality he had and this incredible resurgence after the whiteout of the previous day. It was an irrefutable proof of the magic that drugs can do in those times of fun. In fact, Walter Godefroot tried to buy the stage from Pantani, but the Italian, knowing the crude words he'd said about him before the Plateau de Bay, told him that he would never do it. He would work a little, but he wouldn't give victory to a pro ASO rider like Ullrich. And so they reached the last kilometre in Albertville, and we saw a beautiful sprint between those two champions, as if they were chasing the thin white line that united them so much. Pantani launched his attack 250 metres from the finish line, and Ulle came back, little by little in the final stages, to make a final kidney punch after the effort of both riders, and it placed them in parallel. A fantastic narrow victory for the German, who most certainly deserved it that day. The chasing group managed to reduce somewhat the advantage on the tremendous flat to the finish line, and the mediocre Julich now, yes, passed first in this small group with the Spanish Capudo, the son of Merckx, the bald Dane, the Dutch whoremonger, the bald doper Saunier Duval rider, the French guinea pig of US Postal, and the exceptionally well-known Renero at 1 minute and 49 seconds. Ulle was now third in the GC, ahead of Escartin and only 14 seconds behind the mediocre Julich, showing that if it hadn't been for the whitewash of the previous day, Ulle would still have a lot to say in this Tour de France. It was a beautiful revenge, but sadly it could not have its second part the next day. For that same afternoon, the French police ignored Jean-Marie Leblanc and followed the indications of the team manager and former Belgian cyclist. Enric Redant was also arrested since, according to Willy Voet, this member of the TVM staff was involved in the chain of drug trafficking that reached the Festina team. In turn, the French police received a tip-off to do the same thing with the bus of the modest French Big Mat team, an intervention that was key to understanding the events of the following day, events that further changed the history of cycling forever. It was the last day of high mountains for that tour, 149 kilometres between Albertville and Aix-les-Bains, with two first-category passes such as the Crête de Châtillon and the Col du Revard. But after the police events of the previous day, the riders were not thinking about racing. The Spanish teams, Once, Banesto, Kelme and Vitalicio Seguros, agreed that same morning to a collective abandonment as a measure of protest against Omeri Sports. The leader of the protest was a very, very angry Fat Balbas, for he knew firsthand how bad it had been for his former cyclist Alex Zuller and many other directors arrested and mistreated by the police. Manolo Saez knew that his team was doped, but he knew that there were other teams that were much more heavily doped than his, teams such as Cofidis, Telekom or Mercatone, but he also knew that the dignity of the athletes was at rock bottom after how they were being treated by the French authorities. Banesto director Eusebio Inzue also complained to the media that he would rather be at home than to have to live in a constant state of panic caused by sports ministers and judges and prosecutors who were interested in making names for themselves and making money. And then there was the cowardly Jean-Marie Leblanc defending the Tour over the stars of the race themselves. Nobody was supporting them, even the UCI. Hein Verbruggen still wouldn't show his face or even show up in France. And so the riders organised themselves, and instead of just stopping as they did in Tarascon, they started pedalling at a very, very slow speed of 20 kilometres per hour during the first kilometres of the stage. And when they reached the 32nd kilometre, now they decided to stop. And this time, the union leader Galibier did not want to participate in the spectacle. He was totally disenchanted with what had happened a week earlier. And so the bald-headed doped Dane saw the light and quickly proclaimed himself as the cyclist's representative, knowing his influence in the peloton and the power he had gained as a former Tour de France champion. He approached Jean-Marie Leblanc's car to tell him that the cyclist was stopping, and he urged him to quickly call that communist sports minister to stop treating the cyclists like criminals, or they simply wouldn't get off the tarmac. We saw Jan Ullrich and Robbie McEwen on the ground, and all the athletes were stopped for 15 minutes, during which time Jean-Marie Leblanc panicked. He knew that the Tour might not even make it to Paris, and they'd lose huge sums of money if everything went on like this. And so this time he couldn't threaten the teams as he had at Tarascon, and he offered a more friendly face. He assured them that he was going to speak to that minister on the phone right now, but the riders should at least please resume the race. Think of the fans. Do it for the fans. Now Riis, always the opportunist, saw that he had his chance to earn Leblanc's favours in the future, and he urged the rest to get up, and gradually all the riders did. All except for Once, with Galibier in the lead. Tired and disgusted with the treatment they'd received, the French champion spoke to the media, and he assured us that he was retiring and whoever wanted to follow him could do the same. He got into Fat Balbas's car, and all his teammates supported him in a withdrawal already agreed, but much earlier than expected. And while Jean-Marie Leblanc went off to have his private conversation with the minister, Marco Pantani took off his number, supported by his old teammate Podenzana, and then Luc Leblanc, Andrea Taffi and others took off their numbers, until Jan Ullrich, the least interested in the stage being cancelled, did the same. The Tarascon leaders had spoken. Galibier pulling out, and Pantani and Leblanc getting the others to stay out of the race. The minutes ticked by as the riders slowly made their way up the first pass of the day. But Jean-Marie Leblanc did not have good news. The minister knew they could make gold, and told him that the police actions would continue as before, and could even be much, much tougher. And so the Tour de France director pooped his pants. As if the story wasn't about him. He sneaked out to tell the cyclists of the minister Marie-Georges Bouffet's intentions. The riders exploded with fury, especially the Catholic firebrand Luc Leblanc in one of his classic episodes. He sent greetings to Jean-Marie and his entire family, and at that very moment he asked all the cyclists to have dignity and end the Tour de France on the spot. But Bjarne Riis, a polyglot, a convincing, persuasive, intelligent, bald man, knew how to convince the peloton and how to defend his own interests, which were obviously in alignment with the interests of Omeri Sports. He asked for patience and understanding from his fellow riders, and then when faced with the shouts from Crazy Luke, there were the calm words of gentle Bjarne, and the riders chose to follow the advice of the shiny-headed Dane. And at that very moment, Riis embraced Jean-Marie Leblanc in a shameful, embarrassing image, one where the Telekom rider reminded him that he was so close to building a Danish team of which he would be director, and he asked Omeri Sports for carte blanche for the services rendered on that horrible day. The cyclists could have fought for their rights as individuals, but since then, they lost all possible credibility. In fact, we don't understand why they got so angry when they were called dopers, because when they had the Tour backed into a corner, when they had their finger up Omeri's arse, they lost their nerve, and they soiled themselves, and they started riding again like cowards. Submission. That's all it is. The submission shown was such that Jean-Marie Leblanc could give a monologue on the radio where he appeared as the Sigma male who managed to calm those enraged redneck proletarians. Upon reaching the feed zone, the Benesto and Riso Scotti teams abandoned the Tour de France, even though French TV cameras under orders from Omeri Sports didn't record that moment in order to help cover up the organization's embarrassments. Jean-Marie Leblanc had been on the ropes, but now he felt stronger than ever, and going back on his words to the cyclists, he knowingly allowed the police to pursue the Once traitors in a new police raid in the middle of the Tour de France, and they would not be the only ones. The police searched from top to bottom, coaches and rooms and suitcases and vehicles and soft drinks cans and even the belongings of Pablo Anton, skipper of the Once team in the hotel. Evidently, Manolo Saez had prepared his cyclist well, so the police didn't find anything. But what he didn't expect was that the police would arrest Dr. Nicolas Terrados himself, the team doctor living in Avilés, since Alex Zuller had informed on him and admitting that he had personally supplied him with EPO. This doctor was later very important in Spanish sporting successes, such as that of the basketball player Pau Gasol, who was very happy to enjoy the personal treatments of such a chemistry lover. The French police also arrested him for smuggling drugs into the country, as they did with Festina. They tricked him with the promise that he would be released the next day. The reality was that from that night on he was cut off from the outside world and taken to the filthiest and tiniest of dungeons. But theirs was not the only team to be persecuted. Luc Leblanc's Polti were immediately the next ones, searched by the police because the angry Catholic had declared actively and passively that he would abandon that farce of a race. And this made Jean-Marie Leblanc very angry, and so he gave carte blanche to the police to investigate those Italians. Despite the fact that everyone was doping, the tour director only protected those who'd have defended his own interests. The doctors of many teams fled, and the police were absolutely off the leash. The former Festina riders Emmanuel Magnon of FDJ and Gilles Bouvard of Casino had testified the day before at the police station about the doping practices of those teams, including, in the case of the Frenchman from Casino, statements about the doping and trafficking practices of the cyclist Rodolfo Massi. He was immediately declared a wanted man by the French police, public enemy number one, as if he were a serial killer being hunted by the FBI. And thus the French authorities searched Lotto and Casino and FDJ hotels. And meanwhile, that farcical stage, continued to wind its way at a very slow pace. And the fans even fought with the athletes, asking them to stop and to retire and to put an end to that pitiful spectacle. But they continued, and they did it with an even more pathetic pace. At the finish line in Ixliban, they allowed the 4 TVM riders, humiliated the day before, to cross the finish line at the head of the pack, amidst some applause and strange attitudes from some riders. Of course, no times were taken, and there was no official winner of that stage. Just Marco Pantani, Erik Zabel, and the wanted and pursued Rodolfo Massi were the leaders of their respective classifications. And at the same time, because it was already 8 p.m. when the riders reached the finish line, well, time was marching on, and after finishing this show, the leader of the mountain classification was duly arrested by the French authorities, since in the search of the Casino team hotel, they found some doses of corticoids, more than enough to get him arrested and expelled from the race, despite being in the top 10 overall and leader of the King of the Mountains competition. Some say the tip-off was even the work of Jean-Marie Leblanc himself, who wanted to sell the image of the already well-known Christophe Renero as the new great hope of world cycling. Curiously, the scab, Bjarne Riis, was the first to tell the media that Massi was a drug dealer, and that was why he had to be arrested. Information that the rider didn't know until then, so it was quite clear that the veteran Italian rider, who Bjarne must have known for many years cycling in the Transalpine country, was the dealer who passed the drugs to the bald Dane in 1998. His teammate Jan Ullrich was also extremely angry, but that was more because he didn't have the opportunity to attack and try to beat Pantani. He was there calling Festina and TVM dopers in a totally hypocritical way. He was complaining about the riders who'd gone on strike, like Galibier or Leblanc, for not looking after Telekom's interests, and he was assuring us all that if he had attacked, everyone would have ganged up and tried to stop him. The other 2 Spanish teams also abandoned the race. On the one hand, there was Vitalicio Seguros of Bialitas Casero and director Javier Minguez, who had also worked with Ufe Fuentes in Amaya Seguros and managed to get the Murcian mummy to win the World Championships at the age of 38. This team was also investigated by the police with their raids. And on the other hand, there was the Kelme of Pepe Quiles and Alvaro Pino, who, despite having Fernando Escartin at 4th place in the overall standings, had also agreed to retire with the rest of the Spanish teams. The latter, however, showed a different position to that of the rest of the Spaniards. Manager Joan Mas assured Jean-Marie Leblanc that they were withdrawing due to pressure from the Spanish press. encouraged by the Once team, assured that Say's disciples were angry about the hematocrit limit, which they clearly exceeded. He also acknowledged that the Kelme team was doping, but with a smaller budget, and yet they were able to match the doped Once team in sporting performance despite buying far less drugs. Jean-Marie Leblanc took these anti-Once statements into account and publicly defended both Vitalicio and Kelme, and then he went on to thank Bjarne Riis and the 103 riders who were still in the race for defending the interests of the Tour de France, which was going to end like the previous 84, selling a Christian morality tale to the media, one which was absolutely pitiful for someone who really knew what was going on behind the scenes. For now, Amaury Sports had won the battle against the cyclists. The Tour was above them, it was bigger than them, and they had been able to convince TVM and Big Mat, Lotto, FDJ, Polti, and even Rodolfo Massi's Casino to take to the start the next day. A fact seconded by Riis's friend Bo Hamburger, possibly due to some favour owed by this mediocre cyclist to the Ball Tour winner. From then on, the remaining stages of the Tour were a rather pathetic show that interested few. The next day was a 218-kilometre day to Neuchâtel in Switzerland with a very interesting mid-mountain route, but it hardly made sense with so few riders in contention. Forming the day's breakaway were dangerous doped rider Laurent Desbiens, owing a favour to Telekom, the small-town idol Cédric Vasseur earning a place for the future, the doper's whistleblower and hypocrite Christophe Mangin of FDJ, and Mario Cipollini's friend Massimo Donati. It was a breakaway controlled at all times by Telekom on the mountain passes and by Patrick Lefebvre's Mappé, who was silent during the events of Aix-les-Bains on the flat terrain until they reached the Swiss city that hosted that anodyne day. In Neuchâtel, the bald Riis pathetically launched a sprint to the detriment of Erik Zabel, something that the Belgian champion Tom Steels took full advantage of in the final 50 metres to get out of the Telekom rider's slipstream and win a victory as brilliant as it was anodyne. And then there was the clean O'Grady third and young McEwen in fourth. The highlight of the day was watching Jean-Marie Leblanc's young protégé, the now world star Christophe Renero, take to the podium as the new leader of the King of the Mountains, while Massy was in the dungeon, telling all he knew about doping and trafficking of illegal substances, a classification he had already earned, as there were no more high mountains on the course. But he can't wear a jersey in a dungeon. At the finish line, the TVM team, with Jeroen Blijlevens, who did not ride the stage in the lead, abandoned the Tour, flying from Zurich to the Netherlands after reflecting on the events in Aix-les-Bains, reducing the number of riders in the race to only 96 in an absolutely pitiful Tour. In fact, the next day, the remaining riders had to ride 242 kilometres between La Chaux-de-Fonds and Autun, while the TV ratings dropped as if the Super Bowl halftime show had just brought Rob Pilatus before he died singing playback. 13 men escaped from the most scabby teams. The doped Eddie Mazzolini of Seiko, the always clean Stuart O'Grady and Magnus Backstedt, the big mat Thierry Gouvenou and Thierry Bourguignon, the dangerous casino Lucky Jackie Durand and Christophe Agnolotto, the US Postal, who from then on would enjoy the privilege of Amaury Sports, the pink-tinged Pascal Deramé and Betsy Andrea's husband in one of his few public appearances. There was FDJ's Frédéric Guédon. There was Polti's Fabio Sacchi. There was Rabobank's Martin Dembacker and ASIC's Alain Tourikia. With 10 kilometres to go, the pink-tinted and new ASO protégé Pascal Deramé attacked on a false flat and took with him the clean platinum-blonde giant Backstedt. The former TVM Dembacker, who had finished second in Amstel Gold that season, ever so clean, and the EPO-doped Mazzolini. Arriving in Autun, Dembacker tried to surprise his three breakaway companions, but these three were very, very clever, and on the flat they caught him easily. Deramé launched the sprint as Dembacker looked to overtake him with his top speed, but then from the right came the always clean platinum blonde tinted Backstedt to deliver an impressive win for Sweden, something not seen since the doped up Thomas Brolin and the catchy bongo music of Ace of Base. And he did all this at nearly 47 kilometers per hour average after more than 5 hours of racing. Their lead came to more than 16 minutes on a day that changed very, very little in the overall standings. Much more striking was the exit of Dr. Terrados from the dungeon after paying 100,000 French francs, without being able to testify to the media or to approach cyclists. However, the journalists present were able to obtain police leaks where Terrados had confessed to having doped Once riders to 1997, the dates that Zuller had declared. And of course, all the substances that had been found on him in that summer of 1998 were perfectly legal. They were even for some of his assistants. He showed himself before the police as little more than a victim of the system that was limited to warn athletes about the negative effects of doping, a very common practice among Spaniards. No one seemed to know who M. Rajoy could be who appeared on some accounting papers of black money, or indeed where the money came from, which Luis Rubiales invited escort ladies whom he followed thanks to adult videos to which he was subscribed on the internet. According to the newspaper Le Figaro, the products found in Ixliban were testosterone-like steroids available on the North American market, something which made Manolo Saez very angry. Together with Hervé and Virenque, he decided to take legal action against the Tour and fight for his alleged rights. Meanwhile, the almost flat time trial between Mont-Soleil and Le Creusot of 52 kilometers hardly interested anyone anymore. It was raining, and the only debate was whether Jan Ullrich, the big favourite for the stage, could overtake the mediocre Bobby Julich in the time trial, literally crush him and plunge him into misery. The doped pirate's lead was so wide that it was impossible for even a superclass engine with EPO in his veins like Ully to make up 6 minutes that day. We soon saw how Omeri Sport's deal with US Postal, who had defended Jean-Marie Leblanc's interests, had come true. If in Corrèze tugboat had flown, this time it was the Pole Dariusz Baranowski who was literally crushing the stopwatch with an impressive time of 1 hour and 7 minutes, beating all those who had gone out before him. Riders like Bjarne Riis, with the goal of lying to the press, going clean for these last few days, and getting his job as director for the coming years, were making fools of themselves by being light years away from the Polish letter carrier. Jan Ullrich fulfilled the predictions and quickly took first place at the first intermediate checkpoint, 27 seconds ahead of Julich in his aerodynamic helmet and 49 seconds ahead of Pantani, wearing a cap similar to that of number 1 on that rainy day, and then possibly with the same material that he had worn in Lugano 2 months earlier. Ullrich continued to show all his power to reach the finish line after almost overtaking the whoremonger Bogart with an impressive time, 3 minutes better than Baranowski, at an average speed of almost 49 kilometers per hour in the rain. A third stage win for Ulle, who, even in a sorry state during the full season, had brought out his dope and his class to shine in this Tour de France. The mediocre Julich showed the impressive chemistry he had enjoyed in that edition of the Grand Boucle, arriving in second place just 1 minute behind Ulle after an impressive effort. The Elephantine rider arrived bald and sprinting for the finish line with an impressive time for him, beating Baranowski's records and losing only 2 minutes and 35 seconds to Ulle, much less than the 10 minutes he'd previously lost to Indurain. The number 1 thus fairly overtook the mediocre Cofidis rider who, even so, doped to the gills, managed to become the second American rider after Greg LeMond to reach the podium in Paris. Oh please, let this Tour de France finally end. And it ended, with the famous stage or rest day in Paris, a stage in which the crybaby Erlo and the dangerous Russian of US Postal, Ekimov, tried to spring a surprise with a duo attack with 12 kilometers to go. But Telekom wanted the win for Zabel, and on the final lap of the Champs-Élysées circuit they caught the 2 doped riders. Jalabert's brother tried to give a win to dedicate to Laurent, but the Germans came at him like angry wolves and he was caught before he passed the Louvre. The oh-so-clean Magnus Backstedt was beautifully placed on the last corner to help his oh-so-clean friend O'Grady, but again at the last minute Tom Steels would pull off an impressive win, coming back from the doped Hincapie, the always clean Aussie and his compatriot McEwen to take an incredible victory in Paris. The guy who had been kicked out of the Tour the year before for being an aggressor was now the best sprinter in the peloton, and he climbed atop the podium in Paris. The big loser of that day, and who left this Tour with 0 stage wins, was Erik Zabel, but he climbed back onto the podium with his son Rick as winner of the green jersey, one which few others had fought for in this edition. For his part, the already world star Christophe Runero finished an incredible 4th in the overall classification of the Tour, and he climbed atop the podium in Paris as winner of the King of the Mountains at only 24 years of age. Years later, his teammate and party animal Philippe Gaumont would say in his autobiography that Runero was an EPO addict, and in that 98 Tour, he'd gone from low to high doses until he looked like a zombie on a bike. Of course, the doped Cofidis team, with the mediocre Julich 3rd, the new world star Runero 4th, and the Swiss guinea pig 7th, had swept the team classification, and they all climbed together onto the podium in Paris. And to top it off, the coke addicts Pantani and Ullrich accompanied that mediocre gringo onto the final podium, with the bald man with a dyed blonde goatee, lest the police analyse the little hair that he had left on his body, in case he tested positive in an anti-doping control, something that the entire Mercatone team also did when they all dyed their hair blonde, supposedly in homage to the yellow of their leader Pirates champion jersey. Well, it all added up to be a very strange tour. A tour that had essentially finished days earlier in Aix-les-Bains, and in which only 96 riders reached the finish line. A tour without the Festina team, and with teams escaping from the police, and drug traffickers being swept up and arrested. And just weeks later, the fallen-on-the-obisque Casagrande won the Classico in San Sebastian and ended up being expelled by the Cofidis team after his positive for doping in Romandy and Trentino, which removed the credit scammers from the whitelist of Amaury Sports. And then there were more police searches at the headquarters of Alain Bondu's team, which is why Julich and especially Runero never shone again in the Tour de France. Jan Ullrich never got over the blow of the Galibier, and he became something of a second-class rider who, only outside the Telekom team, was able to reign again in the world of cycling. And Marco Pantani, in 1998, was on Mount Olympus, but few paid attention to his double triumph in the Giro and the Tour. He had had the chance to become a legend, and he could have signed for the very powerful Mappe team of Giorgio Squinzi, who had denounced him for the events of Lugano against Pavel Tonkov. But at the same time, they offered him a large amount of money to defend the interests of that multinational construction company. But Pantani said he preferred to continue advertising supermarkets with his little group of friends, and he ended up digging his grave with his coke addict girlfriend and his anti-establishment rebellious character. Bjarne Riis achieved his goals, and after retiring in 1999, he became the director of one of the most dangerous teams that ever won the Tour de France, the ineffable CSC of dopers like Tugboat or Classico Mano Luigi. Manolo Saez decided to approach Verbruggen's UCI and fight Jean-Marie Leblanc from afar, claiming that although they had not beaten Amaury Sports, they had at least stuck their finger up the arse of the Tour de France. And thus began a fight for diplomatic immunity to be able to dope as before, with some teams being sympathetic to the Tour de France, such as Roger Leger's new Crédit Agricole, and others were more sympathetic to the UCI, such as Saez Once. Jean-Marie Leblanc was willing to do anything so that people would forget the events of 1998. And he assured everyone that a new clean cyclist would appear to show that the new softer routes and shorter time trials that still remain to this day would ensure that we would see a clean super champion. In an interview, he assured us all that this new champion could be the already world star Christophe Runero, a rider who never won anything again except a town race in 2002 and who ended up with Gianetti and Machin at Saunier-Duval almost 10 years later. But there was a super champion on the horizon, and he was made of different stuff. He came from the United States of America, and he brought with him a story of overcoming, where he could make cycling more visible than ever at a global level. A hero that not even he himself expected that July 1998, an hero who ended up being more powerful than the Tour de France itself. A monster that arose solely and exclusively from the events of this tour that I hope you have enjoyed with us. Cycling became the most stinking sport on the planet, but a few knew how to take advantage of it. Now don't forget to leave your like to bring you to the ascent of La Lanza in the Vuelta 1998. And remember, stop by some other videos of ours. But for now, friends, we'll see you in the next one.